Hello there, everyone. Welcome to Nightmare Narratives. I am your storyteller, and I'm here to guide you tonight. I know many of you use these videos to drift off to sleep. So before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. I'm always curious. Where are you watching from, and what time is it in your part of the world? Now, find your cozy spot and relax. My name is Rick Harmon. I'm a park ranger at Shawnee National Forest in southern Illinois. I've been working here for about 5 years now. It's a quiet job, which is exactly what I wanted when I moved here. After serving in Vietnam, I needed peace. No loud noises, no chaos, just the sound of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the wind. I live alone in a small cabin near the ranger station. It's nothing fancy, but it's home. The forest is beautiful, especially in autumn, when the trees turn shades of orange and red. Most people think this place is peaceful, but lately I've started noticing things that don't feel right. It began with little things, like finding deer carcasses torn apart in ways that didn't make sense. At first, I thought it was just a predator, maybe a bear or a big cat. But the tracks around the bodies weren't like anything I'd seen before. They were huge, with long claw marks etched into the dirt. One evening, an old man named Owen Miller stopped by the station. He's lived near the forest his whole life and knows every inch of it. He leaned on his cane and said, "Rick, you need to be careful out there." I laughed nervously and asked him what he meant. "There's something in these woods," he said, his voice low and serious. "Something that doesn't belong here. Folks around here call it the walker between worlds. It comes when the nights get longer." I didn't believe him. Owen's always been superstitious, telling stories about ghosts and monsters to scare people. But as he left, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling his words left behind. That night, as I sat on my porch sipping coffee, I heard something strange. A long, low howl that seemed to echo through the trees. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd heard before. It was deep and guttural, almost human-like. I told myself it was just a coyote, or maybe a wolf passing through. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I tried to shake off the strange feeling from the night before. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But as I walked through the forest on my patrol, that uneasy feeling came back. The woods were too quiet. Normally, you'd hear birds chirping or squirrels rustling in the leaves, but there was nothing. Just silence. About halfway through my patrol, I found another deer carcass. This one was worse than the last. Its body was torn apart, and its ribs were sticking out like someone had ripped them open with their bare hands. The tracks around it were fresh, huge claw marks in the dirt. Whatever did this was big, and it wasn't afraid to kill. When I got back to the station, a man named Dr. Marcus Webb was waiting for me. He was a wildlife biologist who had been sent to investigate reports of strange predator behavior in the area. Marcus was young, maybe in his early 30s, with glasses and a backpack full of gear. "I heard you've been finding some unusual signs out there," he said, looking at me like he wanted answers. I told him about the deer carcasses and the tracks, and he seemed interested, almost too interested. "I'm going to set up some camera traps near where you found the bodies," he said. "If there's something out there, we'll catch it." That evening, as the sun started to set, Marcus headed into the woods with his equipment. I stayed behind at the station, keeping an eye on the radio in case he needed help. Hours passed, and I didn't hear from him. The sun went down, and darkness swallowed the forest whole. At around midnight, Marcus still hadn't returned. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out to look for him. As I walked deeper into the woods, I felt like someone, or something, was watching me. The trees seemed taller and darker than usual, and every sound made me jump. I found Marcus's backpack near a tree, but he wasn't there. His camera traps were smashed to pieces like someone had stomped on them. Next to his backpack was a notebook filled with scribbled notes about large predators and blurry sketches of something that looked like a wolf standing on two legs. I called out for him, but there was no answer. Just that same eerie silence. Chattis. Next day, two campers showed up at the station. Tommy and Jessica Reynolds, a young couple on their honeymoon. They were cheerful and excited about spending time in nature. They told me they'd picked a campsite near a small lake about 3 miles into the woods. "Anything we should know about?" Tommy asked with a grin. I hesitated for a moment before saying no. What could I tell them? That something might be out there? That wouldn't go over well. But as they left with their gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have warned them. That night, as I sat alone in my cabin trying to read a book, I heard that same howl again. Low and guttural, echoing through the trees like it was coming from everywhere at once. I closed my book and stared out into the darkness beyond my window. Something wasn't right. The next morning started like any other. The sun was shining, the air was crisp, and I tried to convince myself that everything was fine. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was coming. Around noon, I was organizing supplies at the station when the door burst open. Jessica Reynolds stumbled inside, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. She was shaking so badly she could barely speak. "Help. Please. It got Tommy," she gasped, clutching her arms like she was trying to hold herself together. I rushed over to her and helped her sit down. "What happened?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm even though my heart was racing. She looked at me with tears streaming down her face. "We were sitting by the fire last night when we heard something moving in the trees. At first, we thought it was just an animal, but then it came closer." Her voice cracked and she started sobbing. I waited for her to catch her breath before she continued. "It wasn't an animal," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It looked like a man, but its face, it had a wolf's head." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Where's Tommy?" "Now?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. She shook her head slowly and buried her face in her hands. "It took him," she whispered. "I ran as fast as I could. I didn't look back." I grabbed my radio and called for backup. Deputy Foster arrived within an hour, along with 2 search dogs and a few volunteers from town. We headed into the woods to look for Tommy. The dogs led us to their campsite near the lake, but what we found there made my stomach turn. The fire pit had been knocked over, and there were deep claw marks gouged into the trees around the site. Marks that were higher up than any bear or wolf could reach. We followed the trail deeper into the forest until we found Tommy, or what was left of him. His body was torn apart, just like the deer I'd found earlier, but this time it was worse. His remains were scattered across the ground like someone, or something, had played with him before killing him. One of the volunteers vomited at the sight, and even Foster looked pale as he muttered under his breath, "What kind of animal does this?" The dogs refused to go any further. They whined and pulled at their leashes like they were terrified of whatever lay ahead. As we stood there staring at the gruesome scene, I felt that same eerie silence settle over the forest. The kind that makes your skin crawl because you know you're not alone. Jessica stayed at the station while we continued searching for clues. She kept saying over and over again, "It's not an animal. It's not an animal." By the time we returned to the station that evening, everyone was shaken up. Foster pulled me aside and said quietly, "Rick, this isn't normal. Whatever did this, it's not something we can handle." I nodded slowly but didn't say anything. He was right. This wasn't normal. That night, as I sat alone in my cabin trying to process everything that had happened, I heard something outside. Soft footsteps crunching through the leaves. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door slowly, shining the beam into the darkness. There was nothing there. But as I closed the door and locked it behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. The morning after we found Tommy, I couldn't stop thinking about what Jessica had said. A man with a wolf's head? It sounded ridiculous, like something out of a bad horror movie. But the claw marks, the tracks, and the way the dogs reacted, none of it made sense. I decided to visit Ruth Johnston, a local historian who lived just outside the forest. Ruth was in her 70s and had spent her entire life studying the history and folklore of the area. If anyone could help me make sense of this, it was her. Her house was small and cluttered, filled with books, old maps, and strange artifacts. She greeted me with a warm smile, but quickly noticed the look on my face. "You've seen something, haven't you?" she asked, her voice calm but serious. I hesitated before telling her everything, about the deer carcasses, Tommy's death, and Jessica's description of the creature. Ruth listened quietly, her expression growing darker with every word. When I finished, she got up and pulled an old leather-bound book from one of her shelves. She opened it to a page filled with hand-drawn sketches of strange creatures and symbols. "This isn't the first time this has happened," she said, pointing to one of the drawings. It showed a creature that looked like a wolf standing on two legs, its eyes glowing in the dark. "People around here have been telling stories about this thing for generations. They call it the Dog Man." I frowned. "The Dog Man? You're saying this thing is real?" Ruth nodded slowly. "Every 13 years, people go missing in these woods. Hunters, campers, even locals who should have known better than to wander too far from home. The stories say it's not just an animal. It's something older." "Older?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. She sighed and leaned back in her chair. "Some believe it's a spirit, a guardian of the forest that punishes those who disrespect it. Others think it's a curse passed down through bloodlines. Either way, it's dangerous." She handed me a small wooden charm carved with strange symbols. "Keep this with you," she said firmly. "It won't stop it, but it might give you some protection." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and thanked her before heading back to the station. That night, as I sat in my cabin staring at the charm Ruth had given me, I heard something outside again, this time louder than before. It wasn't just footsteps, it was heavy breathing, low and guttural. I grabbed my flashlight and my rifle and stepped outside onto the porch. "Who's there?" I called out into the darkness. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then I heard it, a voice calling my name. "Rick." It was soft and faint but unmistakable. "Rick, help me." It sounded like my ex-wife, Sarah. My heart started pounding in my chest. Sarah had left me years ago after we couldn't make things work following my return from Vietnam. She wasn't here, she couldn't be here, but the voice kept calling. "Rick, please." I gripped my rifle tighter and stepped off the porch, shining my flashlight into the trees. "Sarah," I called out hesitantly. The voice stopped, and then I saw them. Two glowing eyes staring back at me from between the trees. They were too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal. I froze as a low growl echoed through the forest. Whatever was out there wasn't Sarah, and it wasn't human. I backed away slowly toward the cabin, keeping my flashlight trained on those glowing eyes until they disappeared into the darkness. When I got inside, I locked every door and window and sat in silence for hours, clutching Ruth's charm in one hand and my rifle in the other. Something was out there, and it wanted me to know it wasn't going away. The next day, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes staring back at me. The voice calling my name still echoed in my head. I couldn't pretend this was just some animal anymore. Whatever was out there wasn't normal. Deputy Foster came by the station that morning to check in. He looked rough, dark circles under his eyes and a bandage wrapped around his arm. "What happened to you?" I asked, pointing at the bandage. He shrugged, trying to play it off. "Something got me last night while I was out checking the perimeter near the campsite. I didn't see what it was, but it came out of nowhere. Fast. I frowned. Did you get a good look at it? Foster shook his head. No, but it wasn't. Small. Rick? And whatever it was, it didn't feel like it belonged out there. Hearing that only made my stomach tighten even more. Foster wasn't the kind of guy to scare easily, but I could see it in his eyes. He was shaken. Later that afternoon, we decided to search the forest together for any signs of the creature, or Marcus Webb, who was still missing. We brought along a couple of volunteers and one of the search dogs, though the poor thing seemed reluctant to go too deep into the woods. About 2 miles in, we stumbled across something strange. A cave hidden behind a cluster of thick bushes. It wasn't marked on any of our maps, and it didn't look like anyone had been there in years. "Think we should check it out?" Foster asked, his hand resting on his holstered gun. I nodded, though every instinct in my body told me to turn around and leave. The cave smelled awful, like rotting meat and damp earth. As we stepped inside, our flashlights illuminated strange markings on the walls, pictographs that looked ancient. They showed figures that resembled wolves standing upright, surrounded by smaller human shapes. One image showed a wolf man holding what looked like a human heart. "What is this?" Foster muttered, running his fingers over one of the carvings. "I don't know," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. At the back of the cave, we found bones. Lots of them. Some were animal, but others were human. Skulls with teeth marks on them, rib cages cracked open like someone, or something, had been feeding on them. One of the volunteers backed away quickly and muttered, "This isn't right. This isn't right," before running out of the cave. As we turned to leave, Foster suddenly screamed and dropped his flashlight. I spun around to see him clutching his arm again. Deep claw marks raked across his skin, fresh blood dripping onto the cave floor. "Let's go," I shouted, grabbing him by the shoulder and pulling him toward the exit. We ran as fast as we could back to the station without looking back. The whole way, I felt like something was chasing us, something just out of sight. When we got back, Foster's wounds were worse than they should have been for such shallow cuts. The skin around them was red and swollen, almost like an infection had set in immediately. He kept saying he felt cold and dizzy before passing out on one of the cots in the station. I called Ruth that evening and told her about what we'd found in the cave. The pictographs, the bones, everything. "You need to stop looking for answers," she said firmly over the phone. "The more you dig into this, the more danger you're putting yourself in." "I can't just ignore this," I replied. "People are dying." She sighed heavily before saying something that sent chills down my spine. "If you want to survive this, Rick, you need to stop thinking like a man and start thinking like someone who believes." That night, as I sat alone in my cabin once again clutching Ruth's charm for dear life, I realized she was right. This wasn't something I could explain with logic or reason. This was something else entirely, and if I didn't figure out how to stop it soon, more people were going to die. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose. Ruth's words kept repeating in my head. Stop thinking like a man and start thinking like someone who believes. If I wanted to survive this and protect anyone else from getting hurt, I had to face the truth. I drove to the edge of town to meet with an elder from a nearby indigenous community. His name was Samuel Greyfeather, and Ruth had mentioned him once before as someone who knew the old stories better than anyone else. Samuel listened quietly as I told him everything about the attacks, the cave, and the creature Jessica described. When I finished, he nodded slowly, like he'd heard it all before. "You're dealing with a skinwalker," he said calmly. "A skinwalker?" I asked, confused. "It's a spirit that can take on the form of a man or beast," he explained. "But this one, it's become something worse. It's no longer just a spirit, it's flesh and blood now, bound to this world by hatred and hunger." I felt a chill run down my spine. "How do we stop it?" Samuel leaned forward, his expression serious. "You can't kill it. Not in the way you think. But you can trap it. weaken it. He pulled out a small pouch filled with silver dust and handed it to me. Silver is its weakness. You'll need this, and blood to lure it out. Blood? I asked, my stomach twisting at the thought. He nodded. It feeds on fear and life force, but blood will draw it in faster than anything else. He also gave me instructions for a ritual, a way to bind the creature using symbols carved into the ground around its lair. You'll only have one chance, he warned me. If you fail, it will never stop hunting you. Back at the station, I spent the entire day preparing for what was coming. I gathered supplies, silver bullets for my rifle, rope, flares, and anything else I thought might help. I carved the symbols Samuel had shown me onto wooden stakes and packed them into my bag. I knew where I had to go, the cave we'd found earlier. That was its lair, its home base. If I could lure it there and complete the ritual, maybe, just maybe, I could stop this thing. But as night fell, doubt started creeping in. What if Samuel was wrong? What if this thing couldn't be stopped? What if I didn't make it out alive? I shook those thoughts away and focused on what needed to be done. The next morning brought an unexpected surprise. My daughter, Emily, showed up at the station unannounced. She was supposed to visit next month during her college break, but here she was, standing in front of me with her backpack slung over one shoulder. "Hey, Dad," she said with a smile. "Thought I'd come early and surprise you." My heart sank immediately. This wasn't right. She shouldn't be here now. Not with everything going on. "Emily," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice steady, "you shouldn't have come." Her smile faded as she looked at me with concern. "What's wrong?" Before I could answer, something clicked in my mind, a horrible realization that made my blood run cold. This wasn't Emily. She wasn't supposed to be here yet. And how would she have even known about what was happening? I took a step back and reached for Ruth's charm in my pocket. "Emily," I said slowly, keeping my eyes on her face. "What day is it?" She frowned. "What? Dad, are you okay?" "What day is it?" I repeated firmly. She hesitated for just a moment, but that hesitation was enough. Her face twisted into something unnatural, a grin that stretched too wide for her face, and her voice changed into something low and guttural. "You're smarter than I thought," she growled before lunging at me. I barely managed to grab my rifle in time and fired a shot into her chest, or rather, its chest. The creature let out an ear-piercing scream as its body shifted back into its true form, a towering figure with glowing eyes and sharp claws. It wasn't human anymore. Not even close. I grabbed my bag and ran for the forest as fast as I could, knowing it wouldn't be far behind. By the time I reached the cave, night had fallen completely. The forest was pitch black except for the beam of my flashlight bouncing off the trees as I ran. I could hear it behind me, heavy footsteps crunching through the leaves, getting closer with every second. When I reached the cave entrance, I quickly set up the stakes in a circle around me and sprinkled the silver dust across the ground, just as Samuel had instructed. The creature emerged from the shadows moments later, its glowing eyes locked onto mine. "You can't stop me," it snarled, in that same guttural voice that made my skin crawl. "We'll see about that," I muttered under my breath as I raised my rifle and fired another silver bullet straight into its chest. The creature howled in pain, but didn't fall. It just got angrier. It charged at me with incredible speed, slashing at my arm before I could dodge out of the way. Pain shot through me like fire as blood dripped onto the ground. But then something strange happened. The symbols carved into the stakes began to glow faintly as if they were reacting to my blood, mixing with the silver dust on the ground. The creature froze mid-step and let out another ear-piercing scream as its body began to convulse violently. Didn't waste any time. I grabbed one of the stakes and drove it into its chest while shouting the words Samuel had taught me for the ritual. The creature let out one final howl before collapsing onto the ground. And then, Silence. It was. Over. At least, for now. It's been a year since that night in the cave. A lot has changed, but some things haven't. I survived, but not without scars. Both the kind you can see and the kind you can't. The claw marks on my arm healed, but they left behind jagged lines that remind me every day of what happened. The nightmares are worse, though. I still wake up in the middle of the night, hearing that howl or seeing those glowing eyes staring back at me in the dark. After everything, I decided to leave Shawnee National Forest. I couldn't stay there. Not after what I'd seen, not after what I'd done. The memories were too strong, and every shadow felt like it was hiding something waiting to pounce. I moved closer to Emily's college so I could be near her. She doesn't know everything that happened, not the full story, but she knows enough to understand why I left. She visits often, and we've grown closer over the past year. She's been my anchor, keeping me grounded when the memories threaten to pull me under. As for the dogman, I don't know if it's gone for good. Samuel warned me that rituals like the one I performed don't kill creatures like that. They just bind them, weaken them. He said it might come back someday, maybe in another 13 years, maybe sooner. Sometimes I think I see signs, claw marks on trees when I'm out hiking, strange howls in the distance, but I tell myself it's just my imagination playing tricks on me. At least, that's what I want to believe. I keep Ruth's charm with me at all times now, tucked into my pocket like a lifeline. It's silly, but it makes me feel safer somehow. Life goes on, but I know better than to let my guard down completely. Because, out there, in the dark corners of the world, some things never really go away. My name is Martin Calloway. I'm a limnologist, which means I study lakes and everything that happens in and around them. It's not exactly a glamorous job, but it's my life. Or at least it used to be. Now, I'm not sure what's left of me. It all started in late summer of 1954 when I was transferred to Stillwater Basin, a remote lake tucked deep in the Adirondack Mountains of New York. The place was beautiful but eerie, surrounded by ancient hemlock trees that seemed to whisper in the wind. The lake itself was like a mirror, perfectly still most of the time, reflecting the dense forest around it. But there was something about it that didn't feel right. The weather was strange from the moment I arrived. It was unseasonably cold for summer, and a thick fog clung to the surface of the water like it didn't want to let go. Even when the sun came up, the mist stayed put, making it hard to tell where the water ended and the air began. It messed with your eyes, made you feel like you were seeing things that weren't there. The ranger outpost where I stayed was on a little peninsula that jutted into the deepest part of the lake. They'd measured it at 312 feet, deeper than most lakes in this region, but something told me there was more to it than that. The nearest town was 27 miles away, and you could only get there by boat and then hiking through miles of dense forest. In other words, I was completely cut off from civilization. At first, everything seemed normal enough. Quiet mornings with the sound of water gently lapping against the rocks and an occasional loon call echoing across the lake. But even those sounds felt off. The loons' cries were more distressed than usual, like they were warning us about something. One morning, while taking notes on wildlife behavior near the shore, I noticed something strange. A school of trout swam near the surface in perfect, geometric patterns, like synchronized swimmers at an aquatic show. I'd never seen fish behave like that before. It wasn't natural. Then, things got worse. Fish started washing ashore with translucent skin and bulging eyes that looked far too developed for their species. I couldn't identify them. They didn't match anything in my books or research papers. It was as if they'd come from another world entirely. The air pressure dropped suddenly one afternoon while I was out on my boat, causing my ears to pop painfully. The sky above was clear as day, but something about the atmosphere felt heavy, like a storm brewing even though there wasn't a single cloud in sight. The isolation began to creep under my skin after just a few days. The radio barely worked because of the surrounding mountains, and every time I tried calling for updates from headquarters, all I got was static or broken sentences. It felt like Stillwater Basin wanted to keep me here, alone. And then came the first real sign that something was very wrong, a discovery that sent a chill down my spine even colder than the lake's icy waters. I found fish carcasses scattered along the shore one morning while collecting samples. Their bodies were bloated and pale, almost translucent under the weak sunlight filtering through the fog. Their eyes, they were too big for their heads, bulging out as if they'd been staring at something terrifying before they died. I couldn't explain it, not scientifically anyway, and that scared me more than anything else. I guess I should tell you more about myself. My name's Martin Calloway, and I'm 43 years old. People say I look older than I am, probably because of my thin, tired face and the scar that runs down my right cheek. That scar came from a boating accident years ago. But honestly, it's not the worst thing that's ever happened to me. I've spent most of my life studying lakes. To me, they're more than just bodies of water. They're alive in their own way. They have personalities, moods, even secrets. Some are calm and peaceful, others are dark and restless. Stillwater Basin felt like one of the restless ones from the moment I arrived. I wasn't supposed to be here, though. My last assignment was at Lake Michigan, where I worked on underwater research projects with a team of scientists. But everything changed last year when my colleague, my best friend, drowned during a dive. I was there when it happened. I tried to save him, but the water took him before I could reach him. Watching someone die like that, it does something to you. After that, I couldn't stay at Lake Michigan anymore. The memories were too much. So they transferred me here, to Stillwater Basin, thinking a quieter place might help me heal. But healing isn't as simple as moving to a new location. My personal life wasn't much better. My wife left me a few years ago because she said I cared more about lakes than I did about her. Maybe she was right. I don't know. All I know is that water has always been my obsession, even when it cost me everything else. I brought one thing with me to Stillwater Basin that reminds me of my old life, a brass diving compass that belonged to my friend who drowned. It's old and worn, but it still works, or at least it should. Strangely enough, every time I bring it near certain parts of the lake, the needle starts spinning wildly as if it's lost its sense of direction. I wasn't alone out here, not completely anyway. Joseph Mills was with me most days. He's a local fishing guide in his early 50s, who knows this lake better than anyone else. He's not an official ranger like me, but he helps out when he can, fixing boats, tracking wildlife, and sharing stories about Stillwater Basin's history. Joseph told me about an underwater cave system that had been discovered recently, a SAR network of tunnels hidden beneath the lake's surface. It didn't appear on any old maps or surveys, not even in indigenous records of the area. That struck me as odd because caves like that don't just go unnoticed for centuries. Joseph didn't trust the lake, not one bit, and he wasn't shy about saying so. "This place has always been strange," he told me one night while we were sitting by the fire outside the outpost. "People go missing here more often than they should." I didn't believe him at first, not entirely anyway, but there was something about his tone that stuck with me. He wasn't trying to scare me. He was just telling me what he knew. Stillwater Basin had a way of making you feel small and insignificant, like you were being watched by something ancient and powerful. But as a scientist, I believed there had to be rational explanations for everything happening here. The strange fish behavior, the translucent carcasses on shore, even the spinning compass needle. I kept detailed logs every day, writing down everything I saw and heard around the lake, and convinced myself that science would eventually make sense of it all. But deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. The first few days at Stillwater Basin were unsettling, but I chalked it up to the isolation. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then things started happening, things I couldn't ignore. It began with the depth readings. I was out on the lake one morning, lowering the sonar equipment to measure how deep the water went. The official record said the deepest part was 312 feet, but my readings showed something different. The sonar kept going past 500 feet. Then, 600, until it couldn't measure anymore. It was like the lake had no bottom. I tried again, thinking maybe the equipment was malfunctioning, but every time, the results were the same. There was a trench down there, a massive one, that no one had ever documented before. How could something like that go unnoticed? The water temperature wasn't right either. Normally, lakes are colder at the bottom and warmer near the surface. But here, it was reversed. The deepest parts were 15 degrees warmer than the surface. That didn't make sense. It felt like something was heating the water from below. Then, there was the taste of the water itself. I don't usually drink lake water. It's not safe. But one day I accidentally got some in my mouth while collecting samples. It tasted metallic, almost like blood. I tested it for contamination but found nothing unusual, except for higher than normal electrical conductivity. That didn't make sense either. Joseph noticed strange tracks near the shoreline one morning while we were out checking fishing nets. They weren't animal tracks, not like anything we'd seen before. They were wide and deep, like something heavy had dragged itself out of the water and into the forest. The marks disappeared into the trees, leaving us wondering what could have made them. At night, things got even stranger. I'd set up underwater microphones to record fish movements and lake currents, but instead of normal sounds, I picked up something else, rhythmic vibrations that sounded like heartbeats. They started, slow at first but got faster and louder as each night passed. Then there were the columns of water. Sometimes during my observations I'd see thin streams of water rising straight up from the lake's surface, defying gravity, and then collapsing back down as if they'd never been there. Joseph saw them too, but neither of us could explain it. The local wildlife seemed to sense something was wrong as well. Deer refused to drink from the lake anymore. They'd rather die of thirst than go near it. We found their bodies scattered around the forest, their mouths dry and cracked from dehydration. One night, I saw something that made my skin crawl. The sky above was cloudy, no stars visible, but when I looked at the lake's surface, I saw a perfect reflection of stars shimmering in the water. It wasn't possible. The stars weren't there, but somehow they appeared in the lake as if it had its own version of the night sky. By this point, I couldn't deny it anymore. Stillwater. Basin wasn't just strange, it was wrong. I didn't see it at first, I only felt it. It was early morning, and I was out on the lake in my boat, checking water samples near the deepest part. The fog was thicker than usual, wrapping around me like a blanket. The air was so still that even the sound of my oars dipping into the water felt loud. That's when I noticed it. The silence. The birds had stopped calling, and even the water seemed quieter than usual. I leaned over the side of the boat to collect a sample when something caught my eye. A pale shape moving beneath me. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, or maybe a school of fish swimming together. But as it moved closer, I realized it wasn't fish. It was one massive creature. It stayed deep enough that I couldn't make out all the details, but I could see its pale, translucent skin glowing, faintly in the water. It was huge, bigger than any animal I'd ever seen in a lake, and its limbs were long and overdeveloped, almost human-like, but not quite. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the boat so tightly my knuckles turned white. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched it glide silently beneath me. It didn't seem to notice me, or maybe it did and just didn't care. When it finally disappeared into the depths, I let out a shaky breath and tried to convince myself it wasn't real. But deep down, I knew better. The next time I felt its presence was during a dive later that week. Joseph had been warning me not to go into the water. He said something about bad luck and cursed places, but I couldn't resist. I needed answers. As soon as I submerged myself in the lake, I felt it again, that strange sensation like thousands of tiny hooks pulling at my skin. The water felt heavier around me, almost alive, like it was trying to keep me there. I didn't see the creature this time, but I knew it was close. The currents shifted suddenly, pulling me deeper even though I wasn't moving my body. It took every ounce of strength to swim back to the surface. When I climbed back into the boat, Joseph was waiting for me on shore with a worried look on his face. "You shouldn't have gone in," he said quietly. "This lake doesn't like strangers." The creature revealed more of itself over time, its hunting techniques, its intelligence, and each encounter left me more terrified than before. It didn't attack outright. Instead, it stalked us from below, circling our boats for hours without making a sound. Sometimes we'd hear strange noises coming from the water, like metal grinding or whispers, but when we looked down, there was nothing there. One night, while Joseph was fishing near the shore, his boat suddenly stopped moving. The engine had been disabled, not broken, but deliberately tampered with. When he looked over the side to check what had happened, he saw something that made him scream. A humanoid shape made entirely of water standing on the shoreline. It wasn't real, not in the way we understand, but it looked so much like a drowning victim calling for help that Joseph nearly jumped in to save it before realizing what it was. The creature wasn't just intelligent, it was manipulative. It knew how to play with our minds and use our fears against us. By the time Joseph and I realized what we were dealing with, it was already too late to leave. The lake wouldn't let us go, not without a fight. Joseph had always been wary of Stillwater Basin, but after his boat was sabotaged and he saw that watery figure on the shore, his fear turned into something else, something deeper. He started talking about the lake like it was alive, like it had a will of its own. At first, I thought he was just shaken up, but the more I saw, the more I started to believe him. The creature wasn't just some mindless animal. It was smart, too smart. It knew how to disable our equipment, how to lure us into traps, and how to make us doubt ourselves. And it wasn't alone. One night, while reviewing my notes in the outpost, I found an old map tucked into one of the filing cabinets. It was dated back to 1879, the year the dam was built that created Stillwater Basin. The map showed the original layout of the land before it was flooded, including an area marked as an indigenous burial site. My stomach sank as I realized what this meant. The lake wasn't natural. It was man-made. When they built the dam and flooded the valley, they disturbed something ancient, something that had been buried for centuries. I told Joseph about the map, and his face went pale. "That explains it," he muttered under his breath. "This lake, it's cursed." The next day, Joseph decided to go night fishing near the shore despite everything that had happened. He said we couldn't let fear control us, that we had to keep living our lives. But deep down, I think he just wanted to prove to himself that he could still face the lake. I stayed behind at the outpost, watching him from a distance as he cast his line into the water. For a while, everything seemed normal, quiet and calm like any other night. But then I heard him scream. I ran to the shoreline as fast as I could and found Joseph lying on the rocks, clutching his leg. His pants were soaked in blood, and there were deep gashes running down his thigh, like something had tried to pull him into the water. "It's here," he gasped, his voice trembling. "It's hunting us." I helped him back to the outpost and bandaged his wounds as best as I could, but I knew we couldn't stay here much longer. The creature was getting bolder, more aggressive, and if we didn't do something soon, neither of us would make it out alive. That's when I came up with a plan, a desperate one, but our only chance. I remembered reading about limestone deposits in some of my research papers, the kind that could affect certain aquatic creatures by irritating their skin or disrupting their senses. If we could find enough limestone powder and use it near the underwater cave system where the creature seemed to retreat during daylight hours, we might be able to drive it away, or at least weaken it enough to escape. Joseph volunteered to act, as bait despite his injuries. He said someone needed to distract the creature while I carried out the plan. I didn't want him to risk his life again after what had happened, but he insisted. "I'm not leaving this place without a fight," he said firmly. As night fell, Joseph took a small boat out onto the lake while I prepared my diving gear and limestone powder near the cave entrance. My heart raced as I slipped beneath the surface and swam toward the dark tunnels below. The water felt colder than ever, heavy and suffocating, but I pushed forward until I reached the cave system. Inside, I found something that made my blood run cold. Clusters of juvenile creatures hibernating in pockets along the walls and prehistoric paintings depicting their life cycle on jagged rocks above. Before I could process what I was seeing, a sudden wave of pressure hit me like a punch to the chest. The creature was here. It had followed me into its lair. I scattered the limestone powder as quickly as I could while dodging its massive limbs sweeping through the water like pale shadows. Every second felt like an eternity as I fought against both my fear and my dwindling oxygen supply. Finally, with one last burst of strength, I triggered an underwater explosion using a small charge Joseph had rigged earlier in case things went wrong. The blast sent rocks tumbling down into the cave entrance, sealing off its main retreat point. But something happened during those final moments, something I still can't explain. As the water settled around me after the explosion, I felt an overwhelming connection to the creature, a telepathic link that showed me centuries of human interaction through its eyes. It wasn't just hunting us, it was defending itself from what we'd done to its home. When I surfaced hours later and dragged myself back onto shore, Joseph was waiting for me with tears in his eyes. We'd survived, but not without scars. After that night, nothing felt the same. Joseph and I had survived, but we weren't whole. His injuries left him limping and weak, and I wasn't sure what had happened to me. The explosion had sealed the cave entrance, but it hadn't destroyed the creature or its young. The lake was still alive, still restless, and so was I. I started noticing changes in myself almost immediately. My skin felt different, thicker, almost rubbery, and my breathing became shallow and strained whenever I was away from the water for too long. One morning, while washing my face in the basin outside the outpost, I saw faint ridges along my neck, like the beginnings of gills. I didn't tell Joseph. He had enough to deal with already, and I didn't want to scare him. But deep down, I knew what was happening. The lake had changed me, marked me somehow, and there was no going back. I spent hours digging through old records about Stillwater Basin, trying to understand what we'd uncovered. The dam project in 1879 had flooded an indigenous burial site, a sacred place that should have been left alone. Workers had reported strange occurrences during construction, tools disappearing, unexplained illnesses, even drownings in shallow water. They called it lake fever, but now I knew better. The Cold War-era military had also taken an interest in the lake's anomalies. Old reports mentioned experiments with sonar technology and underwater weapons testing near Stillwater Basin. They'd noticed unusual readings, too, movements at impossible depths, but dismissed them as equipment malfunctions. They didn't know what they were dealing with. Even now, conservationists were fighting to protect the area from further development, but it felt like a losing battle. The lake was changing, rising slowly beyond the dam's capacity, and if it overflowed into neighboring watersheds, who knows what might happen? Joseph left a few weeks later saying he couldn't stay here anymore. "This place isn't safe," he told me as he packed his things. "You should leave too." But I couldn't leave. Not yet. The lake had taken so much from me already, my peace of mind, my health, even my humanity. But it had also given me something in return: understanding. Stillwater Basin wasn't just a lake. It was a living thing, a guardian of something ancient and powerful. We'd disturbed it with our dams and machines, and now it was fighting back. I stayed behind to monitor the water levels and keep an eye on the creature's movements. Every night, I heard its rhythmic vibrations echoing through the depths like a heartbeat, steady and unrelenting. And then, one morning, as I stood by the shore watching the fog roll across the surface, I saw something that made my heart stop. The water level had risen several inches overnight. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was enough to tell me that whatever we'd done to seal off the cave hadn't stopped it completely. The lake was growing stronger. I don't know how much time we have before it reaches neighboring rivers and streams, or what will happen when it does, but one thing is certain: Stillwater Basin isn't finished with us yet. My name is Richard Holloway, but most people call me Rick. I'm a park ranger and a spelunker, someone who explores caves for a living. I've spent years crawling through tight spaces, mapping out dark tunnels, and listening to the echoes of places most people will never see. But this story isn't about the caves I've explored. It's about the one I wish I'd never found. It was the winter of 1968, and Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky was buried under a heavy blanket of snow. The roads leading to the park were shut down, and the storm had cut off most communication. The silence above ground was eerie. No cars, no birds, just the crunch of snow underfoot and the occasional whistle of wind through the trees. But below ground, in the caves, it was a different kind of quiet. The kind that presses against your ears and makes you feel like you're being watched. I was there with Liam Tanner, a graduate student working on a research project about cave acoustics. Liam was young, only 24, and full of energy. He had brought recording equipment to capture the sounds inside the caves for his study. I wasn't thrilled about having someone tag along, but he seemed eager to learn, and I figured it wouldn't hurt to show him around. The cave we were exploring had been recently discovered, a new chamber hidden deep within the system. It was supposed to be untouched by humans, but as soon as we entered, something felt off. The air inside was colder than usual, and there was this strange smell, like damp earth mixed with something organic and old. The first thing we noticed was how different the acoustics were. Normally, caves echo when you make noise. A clap or a shout will bounce back at you from all directions. But here, it was like the sound just disappeared. Liam tested it with his equipment, clapping his hands and playing tones from a small bowed speaker. The sound didn't bounce back. It got absorbed into the walls. We walked deeper into the chamber, our headlamps lighting up jagged limestone formations that looked almost like human figures frozen in stone. Water dripped from the ceiling, in perfect rhythm, like a metronome ticking away time we couldn't measure anymore. The deeper we went, the more disoriented I felt. Without sunlight or clocks, time in a cave becomes meaningless. It stretches and bends until you forget how long you've been down there. Then we found something strange, a pile of old equipment tucked into a corner of the chamber. It looked like it had been left behind decades ago. Rusted lanterns, ropes that should have rotted away by now, even an old leather satchel covered in dust. But here's the thing. It wasn't dusty at all. It looked pristine, as if someone had just placed it there yesterday. "This stuff is from the 1930s, Liam said, brushing his fingers over one of the lanterns. But this chamber wasn't even discovered until last year. I didn't have an answer for him. All I knew was that my gut told me something wasn't right. As we moved further into the cave system, we noticed blind cave salamanders gathering near an entrance to another chamber. These creatures are rare. They live their whole lives in darkness, but there were dozens of them clustered together like they were trying to escape something deeper inside. "Rick," Liam said quietly, "do you hear that?" I stopped and listened. At first, I thought it was just water dripping again, but then I realized it wasn't water at all. It was a low hum coming from somewhere deeper in the cave. It sounded unnatural, like machinery, or maybe even breathing. "Let's keep moving," I said, trying to sound calm even though my heart was pounding. As we stepped into the next chamber, everything changed. The air shifted suddenly, rushing past us like wind being sucked into a vacuum. My ears popped from the pressure change, and Liam stumbled forward. "What's happening?" he asked nervously. "I don't know," I replied honestly. The walls around us seemed alive somehow, like they were pulsing with energy we couldn't see but could feel deep in our bones. And then came another discovery. Primitive flutes carved from what looked like human bone scattered near an entrance to yet another chamber. I picked one up carefully. It felt wrong to touch it, and stared at its intricate carvings. Who had made these? And why? We didn't have time to answer those questions because that hum grew louder, deeper, and more unsettling with every step we took. I should probably tell you a little more about myself before we go any further. My name is Rick Holloway, and I've been exploring caves for most of my life. I'm 37 years old, and if you saw me, you'd probably think I look like someone who spent too much time underground. Wiry, a little rough around the edges, with calloused hands and clothes that are always covered in dust. I wasn't always like this. There was a time when I had a wife, a home, and what some might call a normal life. But that all changed 2 years ago when I nearly died in a cave collapse. I was trapped for almost 36 hours in total darkness, pinned under rocks with barely enough air to breathe. By the time they pulled me out, something inside me had changed. I couldn't explain it, but the caves didn't feel like home anymore. They felt like they were watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. That fear stuck with me, even though I tried to push it down. My wife, ex-wife now, said I wasn't. The same person after that. She begged me to quit caving, but I couldn't do it. It's not just my job, it's who I am. So she left, and I stayed behind, diving deeper into the darkness as if it could somehow fix what was broken inside me. The only thing that kept me going was my ability to navigate caves by sound. You see, I have this strange gift, perfect pitch. It means I can hear tiny differences in sound and use them to figure out where I am. In total darkness, when most people would panic, I can listen to the echoes and tell which way leads back to safety. It saved my life more times than I can count. That's why Liam asked me to help him with his project. He was studying how sound travels through caves, how echoes work, how certain frequencies can reveal hidden chambers. He even brought this fancy equipment to record subsonic frequencies, sounds too low for the human ear to hear. Liam was smart, but inexperienced. He didn't understand how dangerous caves could be, or how quickly things could go wrong down there. Still, he was eager to learn, and I figured it wouldn't hurt to show him the ropes. We'd been exploring Mammoth Cave for about 3 days before we found the new chamber system. At first, everything seemed normal. Tight passages opening into larger rooms filled with stalactites and stalagmites. But then we started noticing the strange things. The way sound didn't echo back like it should, the blind salamanders gathering in unusual numbers, and that pile of old equipment that looked like it had been left behind yesterday. Liam was fascinated by all of it. He kept stopping to take notes or set up his recording gear while I kept an eye on our surroundings. "Rick," he said at one point, "have you ever seen anything like this before?" "No," I admitted. "And that's what worries me." He gave me a nervous smile but didn't say anything else. As we moved deeper into the cave system, I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't just the cold or the darkness, it was something else. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us, and every sound we made seemed too loud against the unnatural silence. I tried to shake it off and focus on getting us through safely. That's when Liam stopped suddenly and pointed at something. On the ground. "Look," he whispered. I followed his gaze and saw footprints, bare, human footprints, leading through the mud toward one of the side chambers. They were fresh enough that you could see every detail of the toes and heels. "Is someone else down here?" Liam asked. "They can't be," I said firmly. "The storm cut off all access roads." "Then how do you explain those?" he pressed. I didn't have an answer for him because deep down I knew those prints shouldn't exist. We followed them cautiously into the side chamber, our headlamps casting long shadows on the walls. The footprints stopped abruptly at a vertical rock face, a sheer wall with no handholds or ledges. "No way someone climbed up there barefoot," Liam said quietly. "Let's keep moving," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady even though my stomach was churning with unease. As we turned back toward the main passage, something caught my eye. A faint shimmer on one of the limestone formations near the chamber entrance. It looked almost like movement. "Did you see that?" Liam asked nervously. "I don't know," I admitted again. We stood there for a moment in silence, staring at the formation as if it might come alive at any second. But nothing happened. "Let's go," I said finally, leading him back toward our original path. But as we walked away from that chamber, one thought kept nagging at me. If those footprints weren't ours, whose were they? We kept moving deeper into the cave, but something about the air had changed. It wasn't just cold anymore. It felt alive, like it was shifting around us. Every breath I took seemed heavier, harder to pull into my lungs. Liam must have felt it too because he kept glancing over his shoulder, his face pale in the glow of his headlamp. "Rick," he said after a while, "do you hear that?" I stopped and listened. At first, I didn't hear anything unusual, just the steady drip of water from the ceiling and the faint hum of the cave. But then I noticed something else. It was a low, deep sound, almost like a vibration, coming from somewhere far ahead of us. It wasn't natural. Caves don't make sounds like that. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I hear it." Liam pulled out his recording equipment and set it up on a flat rock. He turned a few dials and adjusted the microphone, his hands shaking just enough for me to notice. "It's subsonic," he said, after a moment. "Too low for most people to hear, but it's there." "What's causing it?" I asked. He shook his head. "I don't know." We stood there for a minute, listening to that strange hum as it seemed to grow louder and deeper, like it was coming closer. I wanted to turn back right then and there, but something kept pulling me forward. Curiosity, maybe, or just plain stubbornness. As we moved further into the cave system, the hum faded slightly, but the unease didn't go away. In fact, it got worse. The next chamber we entered was massive, easily the size of a small cathedral, with walls that stretched so high our headlamps couldn't reach the ceiling. The floor was slick with mud and scattered with strange objects. Bones, mostly animal, but some that looked disturbingly human. And near the center of the chamber were several primitive flutes carved from what looked like bone. Liam picked one up carefully and held it under his light. "These are ancient," he whispered. "Maybe pre-colonial." "Put it down," I said sharply, my voice echoing louder than I intended. He looked at me, startled, but did as I asked. There was something about those flutes that made my skin crawl, like they weren't meant to be touched or even looked at for too long. I couldn't explain why. I just knew we needed to keep moving. As we crossed the chamber, Liam's equipment started acting up again. The microphone picked up faint whispers, words in a language neither of us could understand. But when we stopped to listen with our own ears, there was nothing there. "Must be interference," Liam muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. "Interference from what?" I asked. He didn't answer. Then we saw them. More footprints in the mud. They were barefoot like before, but fresher this time. So fresh that water was still pooling in them as if someone had just walked through moments ago. "Rick," Liam started, but I cut him off. "I know," I said. "Let's keep going." The footprints led us into another narrow passage where the walls seemed to close in tighter with every step we took. The air here was even heavier than before, and the hum had returned. Louder now and almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat. That's when we found the tracks on the walls. At first, I thought they were scratches or marks left by animals. But then, I realized they were footprints. Bare, human footprints. leading straight up a vertical rock face as if someone had walked up it like it was flat ground. "That's not possible," Liam whispered. "No," I agreed. "It's not." We stood there staring at those tracks for what felt like forever before Liam finally broke the silence. "Rick, what if we're not alone down here?" I didn't answer because deep down, I already knew he was right. We kept moving forward, because turning back didn't feel like an option anymore, not with whatever was behind us leaving those prints on the walls. But every step we took seemed harder than the last, like something was trying to push us back or pull us deeper into. The cave, I couldn't tell which. Then came the echoes. At first, they sounded normal, just our voices bouncing off the walls as we spoke quietly to each other. But then they started changing. My voice would echo back with words I hadn't said or tones that didn't match mine at all. Sometimes it sounded like someone else entirely, a voice too deep or too high-pitched to be mine or Liam's. "You heard that too, right?" Liam asked after one particularly strange echo came back with what sounded like laughter mixed into it. "Yeah," I said tightly. "I heard it." We tried testing it out by staying silent for a moment and then clapping, our hands or stomping our feet on the ground. The echoes came back wrong every time, delayed by seconds too long or distorted in ways that made my stomach twist with unease. And then came the final straw, the thing that made me realize we were in serious trouble. I called out Liam's name as he walked ahead of me into another chamber, a simple, "Hey Liam," to get his attention. But when my voice echoed back from deeper in the cave, it wasn't alone. It came back with another voice layered on top of mine, a voice that sounded exactly like Liam saying something I couldn't quite make out, but knew wasn't right. Liam froze in place and turned to me slowly, his face pale as a ghost. "That wasn't me," he whispered. "I know," I said quietly, and for the first time since we entered that cave, I felt real fear settle into, my chest like a weight I couldn't shake off. We didn't say anything for a while after that. What could we say? The sound of Liam's voice coming back from the cave, layered over my own, wasn't something we could explain. And the worst part was, it felt like the cave was listening to us, like it was waiting. We kept moving, but the tension between us was thick. Liam stayed close behind me now, his usual curiosity replaced by quiet fear. His recording equipment hung at his side, forgotten for the moment, as if even he didn't want to know what it might pick up. The passage we were in opened into another chamber, smaller this time but with walls that seemed to shimmer under our headlamps. At first, I thought it was just moisture or minerals reflecting the light, but then I realized it wasn't the walls themselves. It was the air around them. It looked like heat waves rising off asphalt on a hot day, except there was no heat here. Just cold and silence. And then I saw it. It wasn't clear at first, just a faint distortion in the air, like a ripple moving through water. But as it got closer, it began to take shape. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch and bend in ways that didn't make sense. Its body was translucent, almost invisible except for the way it warped everything around it. But what stood out most were its ears, or what I thought were ears. They were huge and overdeveloped, curving outward like satellite dishes. And they moved constantly, twitching and turning toward every little sound we made. "Rick," Liam whispered behind me, his voice trembling. "What is that?" "I don't know," I said quietly. My eyes locked on the thing as it moved closer. It didn't walk like we did. It glided silently over the ground, its elongated limbs barely brushing against the floor. And as it moved, the hum we'd been hearing grew louder, vibrating through my chest like a low drumbeat. I motioned for Liam to stay still and slowly backed away from the creature. But then Liam's foot slipped on a patch of wet rock, and the sound echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. The thing froze. Its ears twitched violently toward us, and for a moment, everything went completely silent. No hum, no dripping water, Nothing. Then it turned its head, or what I assumed was its head, toward us. I don't know how to explain what happened next because I've never experienced anything like it before, or since. It didn't make a sound, not directly, but somehow my ears felt like they were being pulled apart from the inside. The pressure was unbearable, and I dropped to my knees, clutching my head as a wave of nausea hit me. Liam wasn't any better. Off. He stumbled backward against the wall, his face pale and his hands covering his ears. The thing moved closer now, its body rippling with every step, or glide, it took. And then I realized what it was doing. It wasn't just making sound, it was canceling ours out entirely. Every noise we made, our breathing, our shuffling feet, was swallowed up by this void around it. I reached for my belt where I kept my tuning fork, a small brass tool I used to test cave acoustics. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was all I had. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold on to it as I struck it against a nearby rock. The sound rang out, a clear, pure tone that cut through the oppressive silence like a knife. The creature recoiled instantly, its body rippling violently as if the sound had hurt it. The hum disappeared for a moment, replaced by an almost human-like wail that sent chills down my spine. "It doesn't like that," Liam said weakly from where he was slumped against the wall. "No kidding," I muttered, striking the tuning fork again and holding it out in front of me like some kind of shield. The creature backed away slightly but didn't leave entirely. It stayed just out of reach, watching us, or listening to us, with those massive ears. "We need to move," I said urgently to Liam. "Now." He nodded and pushed himself to his feet unsteadily. Together, we backed out of the chamber and into another narrow passageway. The creature didn't follow right away but stayed in the chamber as if testing whether we'd make more noise. But as soon as we started moving again, our boots crunching against loose rocks, it began gliding. After us silently. "Rick," Liam said breathlessly behind me, "it's following us." "I know," I replied through gritted teeth. Every time we made even the slightest sound, whether it was a cough or a scuff of our boots, the creature seemed to grow stronger somehow. Its movements became more fluid, more deliberate, and worse yet, it started mimicking us. At first, it was subtle, an echo of Liam's voice calling my name from somewhere deeper in the cave when he hadn't spoken at all. But then it got bolder. "Rick," a voice called from ahead of us. A perfect copy of Liam's voice, but coming from somewhere impossible. "It's not me," Liam hissed urgently when he saw me freeze in place. "I know," I snapped back quietly. We kept moving as fast as we could without making too much noise. A nearly impossible task in a cave where every step echoed endlessly. But no matter how far we went, or how carefully we moved, that thing stayed right behind us. And then came its final trick, the one that nearly broke me entirely. As we entered another chamber, a smaller one with jagged walls and no visible exit, the creature stopped following us directly and instead began producing sounds that weren't just echoes anymore. They were memories. My memories. I heard my ex-wife's voice arguing with me about why I wouldn't quit caving. The exact words she'd said on the night she left me 2 years ago. Then came another sound, the rumble of rocks collapsing during my near-death experience in that other cave, the one that had left me scarred both physically and mentally. It wasn't just replaying these sounds, it was twisting them somehow, making them louder or softer at just the right moments to mess with my head even more. "Rick," Liam shouted suddenly from behind me, snapping me out of whatever trance I'd fallen into. "It's coming." I turned just in time to see the creature gliding toward us again, faster this time, and realized we were running out of options fast. We had no choice but to run. The creature was closing in, and the narrow passage behind us left no room for escape. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest, but I forced myself to focus. There had to be a way out of this. There had to be. "Liam, stay close," I shouted, my voice echoing wildly in the chamber. The creature responded immediately. My voice came back at me from deeper in the cave, warped and distorted, almost mocking. It wasn't just repeating my words. It was twisting them, layering them with tones that made my skin crawl. Liam stumbled beside me, clutching his ears. "Rick, I can't. My head. It's too loud." I grabbed his arm and pulled him forward. "Keep moving. Don't stop." We pushed through another narrow tunnel, the walls pressing in on either side. The air was thick now, almost suffocating, and the hum was back, louder than ever. It felt like it was inside my skull, vibrating through every bone in my body. Then we stumbled into a massive chamber, the biggest one yet. My headlamp barely lit the edges of it, but I could see enough to know this was no ordinary cave. The walls were covered in strange carvings, spirals and patterns that seemed to pulse and shift when I looked at them too long. In the center of the chamber was a massive limestone formation shaped like a perfect dome. And that's when it hit me. This whole cave. I whispered more to myself than to Liam. "It's not natural." "What are you talking about?" Liam asked, his voice shaking. "It's a structure," I said, my mind racing as I pieced it together. "An ancient structure, built to amplify sound." Liam stared at me, confused and terrified. "What does that mean? How does that help? Us?" I didn't have time to explain because the creature was here. It glided into the chamber behind us, its translucent form shimmering in the dim light. Its massive ear-like structures twitched and turned toward every sound we made, feeding off our fear. I gripped my tuning fork tightly, my knuckles white. It was the only thing we had that seemed to affect it, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. On its own. "Liam," I said urgently, turning to him, "we need to use this chamber against it." "What?" he asked, his eyes wide. "This place amplifies sound," I explained quickly. "If we can create the right frequency, something strong enough, it might disrupt the creature completely." "How?" he asked desperately. I looked around the chamber and spotted a cluster of rocks near the dome-shaped formation in the center. They were smooth and hollow-looking, the kind of rocks that could carry sound far and wide if struck correctly. "I'll use the tuning fork," I said, already moving toward the rocks, "but I need you to keep it distracted." "Distracted?" Liam's voice cracked with panic. "How am I supposed to do that?" "Make noise," I said simply. "Anything loud enough to keep its attention on you." Liam hesitated for a moment, his fear written all over his face. But then he nodded, swallowing hard. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay." As Liam started clapping his hands and shouting, his voice echoing wildly through the chamber, I struck my tuning fork against one of the hollow rocks near the dome. The clear tone rang out like a bell, cutting through the oppressive hum of the creature. The effect was immediate. The creature recoiled violently, its body rippling as if in pain. But it didn't retreat. It turned toward me instead, its massive ears twitching furiously. "Rick!" Liam shouted from across the chamber. "It's coming for you!" I struck the tuning fork again and again, each time aiming for a different rock around the dome. The sounds bounced off each other, creating an overlapping resonance that seemed to confuse and disorient the creature. But it wasn't enough. The creature let out a sound of its own, a deep, guttural roar that wasn't just heard but felt. It hit me like a physical force, knocking me backward onto the ground. My ears rang painfully, and for a moment, I couldn't hear anything but high-pitched static. "Rick!" Liam screamed again. I forced myself to get up, clutching my head as I stumbled back toward the rocks. My left ear felt wet. I didn't need to touch it to know it was bleeding, but I couldn't stop now. With shaking hands, I struck the tuning fork one last time against the largest rock near the dome. The sound that followed wasn't just loud, it was overwhelming. It filled every corner of the chamber, vibrating through my bones and making my vision blur. The creature froze mid-glide, its body convulsing violently as if it were being torn apart from within. Its translucent form began to flicker and distort like a bad signal on an old TV set. And then it shattered. There was no explosion or dramatic collapse, just a sudden silence as its form dissolved into nothingness before my eyes. For a moment, neither Liam nor I moved or spoke. The only sound was our ragged breathing echoing softly through the chamber. "Is it gone?" Liam asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think so," I said hoarsely. But even as I said it, even as relief started to wash over me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Didn't waste any time getting out of the cave. Liam was pale and shaking, clutching his equipment like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. My left ear throbbed painfully, and I could feel dried blood crusting along the side of my face. But none of that mattered. We were alive, and that was all I cared about. The way back to the surface felt longer than it should have. Every sound, every drip of water, every shuffle of our boots made me flinch, expecting the creature to reappear. But it didn't. The cave was quiet now, almost peaceful in a way, but I couldn't trust it. Not after what we'd seen. When we finally reached the entrance, the cold air hit me like a slap in the face. The snowstorm had eased up, and the world, above ground, felt almost normal again. Almost. Liam collapsed onto the snow-covered ground outside, breathing heavily. "I thought we were going to die down there," he said, his voice trembling. "Me too," I admitted quietly. We sat there, for a while in silence, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. But even as I stared out at the snow-covered trees, my mind kept drifting back to the cave, to the creature, to the strange carvings on the walls, to the hum that had seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "What was that thing?" Liam asked finally. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I don't think it was alone." Liam looked at me sharply. "What do you mean?" I hesitated before answering. "The sounds. They weren't just coming from one place. They were layered, like there were more than one source." "You think there's more of those things?" he asked, his voice rising with panic. "I don't know," I said again. "But if this cave system was built to amplify sound, maybe it wasn't just for humans." Liam didn't say anything after that. He just stared at me with wide eyes, his fear written all over his face. As we packed up our gear and started. Heading back toward civilization, I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd found down there, and what it meant. The carvings on the walls weren't random. They were deliberate. Someone, or something, had built that chamber system for a reason. Later, when I had time to think more clearly, I started piecing together what little I knew about Mammoth Cave's history. Native American legends spoke of caves where music should never be played, places where sound could awaken something ancient and dangerous. And during World War II, scientists had experimented with acoustic weapons, devices designed to incapacitate enemies using sound waves alone. Even more, recently, researchers studying lunar communication had tested advanced acoustic technology in caves like Mammoth because their properties mimicked conditions on other planets. It all connected somehow, the legends, the science, the creature we'd encountered. But no matter how hard I tried to make sense of it, one question kept haunting me. What if we hadn't destroyed it? What if we'd only disrupted it temporarily? A week later, as I sat alone in my small cabin near the park, Liam sent me one final recording from his equipment, the last file it had captured before we escaped the cave. At first, it sounded like nothing, just static mixed with faint echoes of our voices as we ran through the tunnels. But as I listened closer, I heard something else. Harmonic patterns layered beneath the static, patterns that didn't belong to us. And then came the hum, the same deep vibration that had followed us through the cave. But this time, it wasn't alone. There were multiple frequencies now, dozens of them, and they seemed to shift and overlap, like voices speaking in an ancient language no human could understand. I turned off the recording and sat there in silence for a long time. Whatever we'd encountered down there, it wasn't gone. And somehow, I knew it never would be. My name is Daniel Thorpe. I'm 34 years old, a Korean War veteran, and for the past 3 years, I've worked for the Forest Service. I'm not sure why I took this job. Maybe it's because being out here in the wilderness feels safer than being around people. Or maybe it's because I don't trust myself anymore. Either way, here I am, stationed at a remote fire lookout tower on Echo Mountain in Washington State. It's early autumn, 1963, and the weather couldn't be more perfect. The sunlight filters through the ancient pine trees, casting dappled shadows on the moss-covered ground. The air smells fresh and clean, and the sound of chickadees chirping mixes with the rustling of squirrels darting through the underbrush. Somewhere in the distance, there's a waterfall. It's loud enough to create a constant white noise, but soft enough to be soothing. It's late afternoon now, that golden hour when everything looks warm and peaceful. The shadows are starting to stretch longer across the forest floor, but I don't think much of it. From my tower, I can see a family of deer grazing below. They're so calm and at ease that it makes me feel like nothing bad could ever happen here. But there's something about this place that feels off. I can't explain it. Maybe it's just my mind playing tricks on me again. After all, I've been alone out here for weeks now, with only Ellie Vasquez, the radio operator at the main ranger station, to talk to. She's got a friendly voice and checks in every day to make sure everything's okay, but our connection fades when the weather gets bad. The tower itself is perched right on the edge of a deep ravine, with only one narrow trail leading up to it. It's isolated, 15 miles from the nearest road or settlement, and when the radio cuts out, there's no way to call for help. That doesn't bother me much. I've always been good at surviving on my own. At least, that's what I tell myself. As I scan the horizon with my binoculars, I notice something strange. The deer suddenly freeze in place. All of them turn their heads at the exact same time, staring toward a rocky outcropping about 200 yards away. They don't move for what feels like an eternity, and then they bolt, running away in perfect synchronization like their lives depend on it. A gust of wind hits the tower hard enough to rattle the windows, and I feel my stomach tighten. The air suddenly feels heavier, like something is pressing down on me. Clouds are building on the horizon now, big ones, and even though it was sunny just minutes ago, I can tell a storm is coming. I glance at my compass, the one my spotter gave me before he died in Korea, and notice that the needle is spinning wildly again. It's been doing that for 3 days now, and I don't know why. I shake off the unease and tell myself it's just nature doing its thing. But deep down, I know better. I guess I should tell you a little more about myself. Like I said, my name is Daniel Thorpe. I've been working for the Forest Service for 3 years now, but before that, I was in the military. I fought in Korea, and, well, let's just say I left a part of myself over there that I'll never get back. I wasn't always like this, jumpy, on edge, always looking over my shoulder. Back then, I was just a kid who thought he could handle anything. But war changes you. It makes you see things you can't unsee. My spotter, Jimmy, he was my best friend out there. We were watching each other's backs until the day he didn't make it. A sniper got him right in front of me. He gave me his compass before he died. A simple thing, but it meant everything to him. I've carried it with me ever since, like it's some kind of lifeline. But lately, even the compass feels off. The needle's been acting strange, spinning like it doesn't know which way is north anymore. It's probably broken, but it still bothers me. After the war, I thought I could go back to living a normal life. I got married to a woman named Sarah. She was kind and patient, everything I needed at the time. But the nightmares started not long after we got married. Night after night, I'd wake up screaming or thrashing around in bed. She tried to help me, but eventually it was too much for her. She left about a year ago. Can't say I blame her. So now it's just me out here, in the wilderness. And honestly, it suits me fine most days. There's something about being surrounded by trees and mountains that makes the world feel smaller. Like all the noise and chaos is far away and can't touch me here. But even out here, I can't escape my own mind. That hypervigilance they taught us in the military, it never goes away. Every sound, every movement catches my attention. Even now, as I sit in this tower scanning the forest below, my brain is cataloging everything. The rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant call of a raven, the way the shadows shift as the sun starts to set. Ellie Vasquez is probably the only person who keeps me grounded these days. She's the radio operator back at the main ranger station, a good 20 miles from here, and she checks in with me every morning and evening to make sure everything's running smoothly. Her voice has this calmness to it that makes you feel like everything's going to be okay, even when it isn't. "Hey, Daniel," she said over the radio earlier today. "You holding up all right out there?" "Yeah," I replied, keeping my voice steady even though something about today felt off. "Just another quiet day on Echo Mountain." She laughed softly on the other end of the line. "Quiet's good. Means you're doing your job." I didn't tell her about the deer or how they bolted like something scared them half to death. Didn't mention how heavy the air felt or how my compass wouldn't stop spinning again. No point in worrying her over nothing. Still, something about this place doesn't sit right with me. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. It should have been beautiful, but instead it made me uneasy. The shadows on the forest floor stretched longer and darker than they should have, like they were alive, creeping toward the tower. I shook my head and told myself I was just tired. I grabbed my binoculars and started scanning the horizon, like I always do at this time of day. It's part of my job, checking for smoke, making sure no fires have started. But as I swept across the ridges and valleys, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a tree stump or a rock, but then I realized it was standing too tall, too straight. It looked like a person, a figure, standing perfectly still on a ridge about a mile away. My heart skipped a beat. "Hello," I muttered under my breath, even though I knew they couldn't hear me. I adjusted the focus on my binoculars to get a better look, but when the image cleared, there was nothing there, just trees and rocks like normal. I lowered the binoculars and rubbed my eyes. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. But when I looked again, that part of the ridge felt wrong somehow, like the air around it was heavier, darker. I tried to shake it off and went back to scanning the forest, but something wasn't right. The usual sounds of the wilderness, the birds chirping, the squirrels rustling in the underbrush, were gone. Completely gone. The silence was so loud it made my ears ring. I leaned out over the railing of the tower and listened harder, hoping to hear anything. A breeze through the trees, a distant animal call. But there was nothing, just that heavy, suffocating silence. Then I smelled it, a sharp metallic tang in the air like wet copper mixed with ozone. It hit me so suddenly that I gagged and had to cover my nose with my sleeve. The smell didn't belong here. It wasn't natural. I climbed down from the tower to check things out on foot, even though every instinct in my body told me to stay put. My boots crunched against the gravel path as I made my way toward where I'd seen the deer earlier that afternoon. That's when I found it. A deer carcass lay sprawled on the ground, its body split open with surgical precision from neck to tail. Its organs were gone, completely removed, but there wasn't a single drop of blood anywhere around it. The cut was too clean for an animal attack, and no hunter would leave a kill like this behind. I crouched down next to it, feeling my stomach churn as I examined the body closer. The metallic smell was stronger here, almost overpowering now. "What the hell?" I whispered to myself. Suddenly, a crackling noise came from my radio, the one clipped to my belt, and made me jump so hard I nearly dropped it. "Daniel? You? There?" Ellie's voice came through faintly, distorted by static. I grabbed the radio and pressed the button to respond. "Yeah, Ellie, I'm here." "You okay? You sound off," she said. "I'm fine," I lied, glancing back at the deer carcass and feeling anything but fine. "Just weird weather out here." There was a pause on her end before she spoke again. "Well, we're picking up some strange readings. At base," she said cautiously, "barometric pressure's dropping fast, faster than it should be, and humidity spiking way past normal levels." "Yeah," I muttered, looking up at the sky as dark clouds began rolling in faster than I'd ever seen before. "I can feel it." The radio crackled again before her voice came through one last time. "Stay safe out there, Daniel." And then, silence. I tried calling her back, but all I got was static. As I made my way back to the tower, something else caught my attention. Footprints, in the dirt near its base. They looked human at first glance, but were wrong somehow. Each print had 6 toes instead of 5, and they were pressed so deep into the ground that whoever, or whatever, made them must have been impossibly heavy. My chest tightened as I followed them around the base of the tower until they suddenly stopped. Like whoever had been walking just vanished into thin air. By now, dusk had settled over Echo Mountain, and everything felt darker than it should have been for this time of evening. As I climbed back up into the tower and locked the hatch behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. When night finally fell and I scanned the forest one last time with my binoculars, that's when I saw it again. A figure, this time much closer, standing motionless in a clearing about half a mile away. But this time, it looked exactly like me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the clearing, standing there, unmoving, but somehow alive. And the worst part, it looked just like me. Same build, same posture, even the same jacket I was wearing. I kept telling myself it wasn't real. Maybe it was a shadow or a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew better. Something was out there, and it wasn't human. The night dragged on, and the storm finally hit around midnight. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the tower like it was trying to tear it apart. Rain lashed against the windows in sheets, and lightning lit up the sky every few seconds. Normally, I'd find storms like this comforting. Nature doing its thing, reminding me how small we are. But not tonight. Tonight, it felt like the storm was trying to hide something. Around 2 a.m., I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. It started as a faint tapping noise, almost like rain hitting metal. But it wasn't coming from the roof or the windows. It was coming from inside the tower. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Slowly, I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness as I scanned the room, looking for anything out of place. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was coming from the far corner of the room, near the supply shelves. My hands were shaking as I aimed the flashlight in that direction. At first, I didn't see anything. Just my supplies stacked neatly where they always were. Cans of food, a first aid kit, a box of matches. But then I noticed something strange. The cans. They weren't where I'd left them. They had been arranged into a perfect triangle on the floor. I stared at them for what felt like an eternity, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. No one else was out here. There couldn't be. But somehow, someone or something had moved my things while I wasn't looking. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. No answer. The tapping stopped. And then, everything went quiet again. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring and your skin crawl. I didn't sleep after that. Instead, I sat in my chair with my flashlight and revolver in hand, waiting for morning to come. When dawn finally broke, it brought no comfort. The storm had passed, but the air still felt heavy and wrong. The forest below looked normal at first glance, trees swaying gently in the breeze, sunlight filtering through the leaves, but something about it felt off. I decided to climb down from the tower to get some fresh air and clear my head. Maybe, if I walked around for a bit, I could convince myself that last night had just been my imagination running wild. But, as soon as my boots hit the ground, I knew something wasn't right. The footprints were back. The same six-toed prints I'd seen yesterday. But now there were more of them. They circled around the base of the tower in strange patterns before disappearing into the forest. I followed them for about 50 yards before they stopped abruptly at a tree, a massive pine with bark so dark it almost looked black. The air around. It felt colder than it should have been for this time of year. That's when I saw it. Movement out of the corner of my eye, just a flicker at first, but when I turned to look directly at it, nothing was there. I stood frozen for a moment, scanning the trees around me with wide eyes and shallow breaths, and then I saw it again, this time clearer. A tall figure stepped out from behind one of the trees about 20 yards away. It was humanoid, but wrong in every way imaginable. Too tall and too thin with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Its skin was pale and almost translucent, like you could see shadows moving underneath it where veins should have been. But its face was what made my blood run cold. It didn't have one. Not really. Its features seemed to slide and shift constantly, never settling into anything recognizable. One second it had eyes, the next second they were gone. Its mouth stretched too wide before disappearing altogether. It didn't move toward me. It just stood there watching me with its featureless face tilted slightly to one side like it was curious or amused. The temperature dropped so fast that frost began forming on my jacket and boots. My breath came out in visible puffs as panic set in. I raised my revolver with shaking hands and fired 3 shots directly at it. The bullets passed straight through, without making a sound or leaving a mark, and then they landed on the ground behind it in a perfect circle. That's when it started mimicking me. At first, it copied my movements exactly. A 3-second delay between me raising my arm and it doing the same. But then the delay got shorter and shorter until we were moving at the same time. And then it spoke. Not with words exactly, but with sounds. My sounds. It repeated everything I'd said over the past day in Ellie's voice mixed with mine. Just another quiet day on Echo Mountain. Stay safe out there. Who's there? Its voice echoed around me like it came from everywhere at once. I ran back to the tower as fast as my legs would carry me, slamming and locking the hatch behind me once I was inside. But even now, as I sit here writing this down, I can feel it watching me from somewhere just out of sight. I don't know how long I sat there in the tower, gripping my revolver and staring at the locked hatch. Minutes? Hours? Time didn't feel real anymore. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind, every shadow that moved outside the windows made my heart race. I kept telling myself I was safe up here, that whatever that thing was, it couldn't get in. But deep down, I knew it wasn't true. It had been inside before, moving my supplies, tapping in the dark. It could get in again if it wanted to. The air inside the tower felt colder than ever, like the storm had left a piece of itself behind. I could see my breath in front of me, little clouds of panic escaping with every exhale. Then it happened. The hatch rattled. At first, it was just a soft sound, like something brushing against it, but then it grew louder. A scraping noise like claws or nails dragging across the wood. My stomach dropped as I stared at the hatch, waiting for it to burst open. "Go away," I whispered under my breath, my voice trembling. "Just go away." The scraping stopped. For a moment, I thought maybe it had gone. Maybe whatever this thing was had decided to leave me alone. But then, a voice. Daniel. It wasn't Ellie's voice this time. It wasn't mine either. It was something else entirely, low and distorted, like it was coming from underwater. "Daniel," it said again, slower this time. My blood turned to ice as I realized the voice wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the tower. I spun around, shining my flashlight into every corner of the room. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I noticed something in the reflection of the window. A figure standing behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. When I turned back to the window, it was closer. Its face, or what passed for a face, was pressed against. The glass now, features shifting and sliding like oil on water. Its pale skin seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, and its eyes, if you could call them that, were dark pits that seemed to pull everything into them. It didn't move like a person should. 1 second, it was at the window. The next, it was across the room without ever seeming to take a step. I fired again, 3 more shots, and just like before, the bullets passed through it without effect. They clattered to the floor behind it in another perfect circle. That's when I remembered. Something. The fire. During training, they'd told us that fire was our last line of defense against wildlife out here. Bears, wolves. They'd all stay away from flames if they were big enough and hot enough. I didn't know if fire would work on this thing, but I didn't have any other options. I grabbed the canister of kerosene from under the supply shelf and started pouring it around the room in a wide circle. My hands were shaking so badly that some of it splashed onto my boots and pants, but I didn't care. The creature watched me silently as I worked, tilting its head like it was curious about what I was doing. Its mimicry had stopped now. It wasn't copying me anymore. It just stood there, waiting. When I'd finished pouring the kerosene, I grabbed a box of matches and lit one with trembling fingers. The tiny flame flickered for a moment before catching on the fuel-soaked floorboards. The fire spread quickly, flames licking up toward the ceiling as smoke filled the room. The heat was intense, so hot that I could feel my skin burning even though I wasn't touching the flames. The creature stepped back as the fire grew larger, its form flickering like a bad signal on an old TV screen. For the first time since, this nightmare began. It looked afraid, but then something strange happened. The compass, the one Jimmy had given me, started vibrating in my pocket. When I pulled it out, the needle wasn't spinning anymore. Instead, it pointed directly at the creature no matter which way I turned. I don't know why or how, but somehow, Jimmy's compass knew what this thing was. Clutching it tightly in one hand and shielding my face from the heat with the other, I stepped toward the creature with slow determination. "Get out," I growled through gritted teeth. "You don't belong here." The creature let out a sound, a horrible screech that made my ears feel like they were going to burst, and then lunged at me. But before it could reach me, I shoved Jimmy's compass into its chest, or where its chest should have been, and pushed with everything I had. The creature screamed again as its form began to dissolve into smoke and ash. The compass glowed brightly in my hand before shattering into pieces, leaving nothing behind but silence and darkness. By then, the fire had spread too far for me to stop it. The tower groaned under its own weight as flames consumed everything around me. I don't remember much after that, just smoke filling my lungs and heat searing my skin before everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on a stretcher surrounded by Forest Service rescue workers. They told me they'd seen smoke from miles away and came as fast as they could, but by then, most of the tower had already collapsed. They asked me what happened up there, why I'd set fire to my own station, but all I could do was mumble something about keeping us safe. They looked at me like I'd lost my mind. And maybe they were right. But as they loaded me into the rescue truck and we started driving away from Echo Mountain, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. My shadow. It wasn't alone anymore. There were 2 of them now. One normal, and one just slightly off. They took me to the hospital after that. Said I had smoke inhalation, a few burns, and some frostbite on my chest, right over my heart. The doctors couldn't explain the frostbite, not with the fire and all. They just shook their heads and told me I was lucky to be alive. But I didn't feel lucky. Not at all. The Forest Service sent someone to talk to me a few days later, a man in a crisp uniform who introduced himself as Chief Ranger Harris. He asked me to explain what happened up there, why I'd burned down my own tower. I wanted to tell him everything. The figure in the woods, the six-toed footprints, the mimicry, the compass, but every time I tried, the words got stuck in my throat. How could I explain something like that? Who would believe me? So I just said, there was a storm. Lightning must have hit the tower. He didn't look convinced, but he didn't push me either. He just nodded and said, "We found something in the debris. Thought you might want it back." That's when he handed me what was left of Jimmy's compass. It was charred and cracked. The glass shattered, but somehow the needle was still spinning. Slowly, lazily, like it was searching for something. I didn't want it anymore. I didn't even want to touch it. But I couldn't bring myself to throw it away either, so I shoved it into my pocket and told him thanks. They let me go a week later. Said I could take some time off before deciding if I wanted to come back to work or not. But as soon as I stepped outside, I knew I wasn't going back. Not to Echo Mountain or anywhere near it. I tried to move on. After that, tried to tell myself it was over, that whatever happened up there was done now. But no matter how far I ran or how hard I tried to forget, it followed me. It started small, little things at first. Shadows moving where they shouldn't be. Strange noises in the middle of the night. The feeling that someone was watching me when no one else was around. And then there were the mirrors. Every time I looked at my reflection, something felt wrong. It looked like me. Same face, same eyes, but there was something off about it. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. One night I caught it smiling when I wasn't. The final straw came a few weeks later when Chief Ranger Harris called me out of the blue. "Daniel," he said, his voice tense, "I've been going through some old records about Echo Mountain, and you're not going to believe this." "What is it?" I asked, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. "We found logbook entries from 1929, 1946, and 1980, he said slowly. All from fire lookouts stationed at that same tower. And they all described, well, they described seeing something like what you saw. My blood ran cold as he continued. They all mentioned strange footprints around the tower, he said, and figures in the woods that looked like them. I didn't say anything for a long time after that. What could I say? "Daniel," Harris asked after a moment of silence. "Yeah," I muttered finally. "I'm here. Just take care of yourself," he said quietly before hanging up. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment with Jimmy's broken compass spinning endlessly on the table in front of me, I noticed something strange. The shadows on the walls weren't coming from any light source, and when I stood up and turned around, there it was again. My shadow, and another one standing right beside it, watching, waiting. My name is Marlene Weathers, and I've been a park ranger for over 2 decades. I've spent most of my life surrounded by nature, studying plants, walking trails, and documenting the secrets of the forest. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the spring of 1978. It was early April, and the Olympic National Park was waking up from winter. The forest was alive with the smell of damp earth and fresh rain. The pine trees stretched high above me, their needles catching droplets from the misty rain that had been falling since dawn. The ground was covered in soft moss. Ferns were unfurling their delicate fronds, and white trillium flowers were just starting to bloom. It was beautiful, peaceful even, but there was something about this part of the forest that felt different. They call it the Cathedral, a section of old-growth forest where the trees are over 800 years old. Standing among them feels like being in a church made of wood and shadow. The air is heavy, quiet except for the gentle shushing sound of rain on pine needles and the distant thrumming of a woodpecker somewhere in the mist. But as I stood there that morning, something felt off. I wasn't alone. James Peterson, a new trainee and eager graduate student, was with me. He was young, barely 22, and full of energy. He reminded me of myself when I first started this job. Curious, confident, maybe a little too sure that science could explain everything. We were investigating reports of a toxic bloom in this area of the forest, a strange fungal growth that hikers had mentioned seeing near one of the trails. It sounded harmless enough at first, just another oddity to document in my leather-field journal, which I've carried for 20 years now. But as we walked deeper into the woods, I started noticing things that didn't make sense. The trees were swaying slightly, but there was no wind. Their trunks seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light, as if they were leaking amber sap that formed strange patterns on their bark. Roosevelt elk moved silently through the mist nearby, but they seemed unusually cautious, almost like they were trying to avoid us or something else entirely. The rain began to pick up, turning into a heavy downpour that made the trail muddy and slippery. James slipped more than once, but laughed it off each time, determined not to seem inexperienced in front of me. I admired his enthusiasm, but couldn't shake the feeling that we shouldn't be here. Not today, not ever. We reached a small creek bed swollen with snowmelt from higher up in the mountains. The water rushed past faster than usual, carrying broken branches and debris downstream. James pointed out how some of the pine needles floating on the surface seemed to form spiral patterns before disappearing into the current. I tried to brush off my unease as paranoia. After all, I'd seen strange things in nature before. But when we crossed into an area where even the birds had gone silent, I stopped walking. "Do you hear that?" I asked James. He paused and tilted his head to listen. "Hear what?" I didn't know how to explain it. It wasn't a sound exactly, but more like whispers? Faint murmurs carried on the wind that weren't there moments ago. James shrugged it off and kept walking ahead while I stayed behind for a moment longer, staring at the towering pines around me. Something about them felt alive. Not just alive like plants are supposed to be, but aware. That's when I noticed something else. My compass needle spinning wildly even though we weren't near any magnetic interference zones. My stomach tightened as I realized this wasn't normal, not even close. The rain poured harder now, soaking through my jacket as James called out from farther down the trail. "Marlene, you need to see this." I hurried after him, my boots squelching through mud as my heart raced faster than it should have been for such a simple hike. What he found stopped me cold. A perfect circle of white mushrooms growing around a massive, lightning-struck pine tree. I crouched down to get a closer look at the mushrooms. They were pure white, almost glowing against the dark soil. Their caps were smooth and perfectly round, like they'd been placed there on purpose. I'd seen mushroom circles before. Fairy rings, they're called, but this one was different. It felt wrong. James was already snapping pictures with his camera, his excitement bubbling over. "This is incredible. Have you ever seen anything like this before, Marlene?" I shook my head slowly. "No, not like this." I pulled out my field journal and began jotting down notes. The mushrooms were growing in a perfect circle around the base of the tree, which had clearly been struck by lightning at some point. Its bark was charred and cracked, but amber sap was dripping from the wounds, forming strange patterns that reminded me of veins. James leaned closer to the mushrooms, his curiosity outweighing any caution he might have had. "Do you think it's some kind of fungus reacting to the lightning strike? Maybe it's feeding off the sap?" "Maybe," I said, though I wasn't convinced. Something about this felt bigger than science, bigger than anything I'd studied in my years as a botanist. I glanced at James as he adjusted his camera lens. He was eager, almost too eager, but I couldn't blame him. He was new to all this, fresh out of school with a degree in environmental science and a head full of theories. He reminded me of my old research partner, Dr. Howard Klein, who passed away suddenly last year while we were on an expedition together. Howard had been my anchor, my closest friend, and losing him left a hole that I hadn't been able to fill. James didn't know any of this, of course. To him, I was just the grizzled old ranger with dirt under her nails and a knack for identifying plants by smell alone. He didn't know how much I questioned myself these days, how much I wondered if I'd spent too much time chasing knowledge and not enough time living. I pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the task at hand. "Let's take some samples," I said, pulling out a small knife and specimen jars from my pack. As I carefully cut one of the mushroom caps free, James held out a jar for me to drop it into. The moment it touched the glass, we both froze. The mushroom began to grow, right there in front of us. It wasn't fast enough to see with the naked eye, but it was happening. The edges of the cap expanded ever so slightly, like it was alive in a way mushrooms shouldn't be. James stared at it with wide eyes. "That's not possible." "No," I agreed quietly. "It's not." I felt a chill run down my spine as I sealed the jar and placed it in my pack. Whatever this was, it wasn't normal. Not even close. James tried to laugh it off as we continued documenting the site, but I could tell he was shaken. And so was I. We spent the next hour collecting samples and taking measurements around the circle. The more we observed, the stranger things became. My compass needle continued spinning wildly whenever I brought it near the circle. When James tried to use his camera again, every photo came out distorted, like there were figures standing in the frame that neither of us could see. The air around us grew heavier with every passing minute, carrying a sweet smell that made my head feel foggy if I breathed too deeply. It reminded me of overripe fruit, cloying and unnatural. James rubbed his temples and frowned. "Do you feel that?" "Feel what?" I asked. "My shadow," he said hesitantly. "It feels wrong." I glanced at him sharply but didn't say anything right away. His shadow did look strange, longer than it should have been for this time of day, and when he moved away from the circle it seemed to lag behind him for just a moment before catching up. I told myself it was just an optical illusion caused by the misty rain and dim light filtering through the trees. But deep down, I knew better. The forest around us seemed to shift subtly as we worked, trees appearing closer than they had been moments ago or blocking paths we'd just walked down minutes earlier. By late morning, James looked pale and uneasy despite his earlier enthusiasm. "I think we should head back," he said finally. I nodded in agreement but hesitated as I glanced back at the mushroom circle one last time. Something about it felt alive. Not just alive like plants are supposed to be, but aware. James and I started heading back toward the trail, but the forest didn't feel the same anymore. It was as if the trees were watching us, their towering trunks closing in like silent sentinels. The rain had eased up, but the mist lingered, curling around the branches and clinging to the ground like it didn't want to let us go. I tried to focus on the path ahead, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that mushroom circle. The way the mushrooms grew before our eyes, the way my compass spun wildly, and those strange figures in James's photographs, it all felt impossible. And yet, it had happened. James walked a few steps ahead of me, his boots squelching in the mud. He hadn't said much since we left the circle, and I could tell he was shaken. Every so often he'd glance over his shoulder or rub his arms like he was cold, even though the temperature wasn't that low. "Are you okay?" I asked. He nodded quickly but didn't look at me. "Yeah, just weird vibes, you know?" I did know. I felt it too. The heavy air, the whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, and the way the forest felt alive in a way it shouldn't. We hadn't gone far when we came across something that made us stop in our tracks. The pine needles on the ground were arranged in perfect spiral patterns, stretching out like trails leading deeper into the woods. James crouched down to get a closer look. "Did someone do this?" I shook my head. "Not likely. This area's too remote for hikers to come this far off trail. Then how? He trailed off, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer for him. The patterns were too precise to be random. Each spiral perfectly formed as if by an unseen hand. We decided to follow one of the spirals for a short distance, curiosity outweighing caution. The deeper we went, the stranger things became. The whispers grew louder. Not words exactly, but faint. Murmurs carried on the wind that seemed to come from every direction at once. I caught myself holding my breath without realizing it, afraid of inhaling too deeply and letting whatever was out there inside me. James stopped suddenly and pointed ahead. Look. I followed his gaze and saw what he was pointing at. A bird, lying motionless on the ground. Its feathers were pristine, untouched by predators or decay, but its body was lifeless as if it had simply dropped dead mid-flight. A few feet away, another bird lay in the same condition, and then another. "What's happening here?" James asked quietly. I didn't answer because I didn't know. My heart was pounding now, and I felt an overwhelming urge to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But before I could say anything, James stepped forward again. "Marlene," he said slowly, his voice shaking just enough for me to notice. "My shadow. It's moving." I froze and looked at him carefully. His shadow stretched out behind him like normal at first glance, but then it shifted slightly, reaching towards something invisible in front of him. "Don't move," I said quickly. He stayed still while I stepped closer to examine his shadow. More closely. It wasn't just moving. It was pulsing faintly like it had a heartbeat of its own. I grabbed his arm and pulled him away from where he was standing. As soon as he stepped back from the spot, his shadow returned to normal, or as normal as it could be under these circumstances. "We need to leave," I said firmly. James nodded without argument this time, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by quiet fear. But leaving wasn't as simple as retracing our steps anymore. The trail we'd followed into this part of the forest seemed to have vanished entirely, replaced by dense undergrowth and trees that hadn't been there before. Every time we thought we'd found our way back, something shifted. A tree blocking our path or a sudden drop-off where there hadn't been one moments earlier. It was like the forest itself didn't want us to leave. We stumbled upon another clearing after what felt like hours of wandering in circles, a clearing that looked eerily familiar. It was the mushroom circle again. I froze when I saw the mushroom circle again. My heart sank, and I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. We had been walking for hours, trying to get away, but somehow we were right back where we started. James looked at me, his face pale and his lips slightly parted. "How is this possible? We didn't turn around, did we?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The air around the circle felt heavier than before, thick and hard to breathe, like something was pulling the oxygen out of it. The sweet smell was stronger now, cloying and unnatural, making my head feel foggy again. "Stay close," I said quietly, gripping James's arm as we stepped back from the circle. But then something moved. At first, I thought it was just the mist shifting in the air, but it wasn't. It was taller than a man, much taller, and it seemed to form itself out of the forest debris, twisting bark, pine needles, and amber sap that glistened like blood running through veins. James gasped and stumbled backward, nearly falling into the mud. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The figure stood there silently, its shape constantly shifting like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. It was 9 feet tall at least, towering over us with a presence that made my skin crawl. Its face, or what passed for a face, was hollow, like a mask carved from wood but alive somehow. I felt rooted to the spot, unable to move or speak as it tilted its head toward us. The air grew even heavier, making it hard to breathe. My lungs burned as I tried to take shallow breaths without inhaling too deeply. Then it spoke, or at least it sounded like it did. The wind whistled through hollow branches somewhere above us, forming words that weren't quite human, but close, enough to send chills down my spine. "Marlene," it whispered in a voice that sounded like the forest itself. James grabbed my arm tightly. "It knows your name," he said in panic. I didn't respond because I didn't know how to process what was happening. It wasn't just saying my name, it was repeating phrases I'd spoken earlier in the day, words I'd said to James while we were walking through the forest. "Stay close," it whispered again, mimicking my voice perfectly. I felt a wave of nausea hit me as I realized this thing, whatever it was, had been listening to us all along. James tried to pull me away from the clearing, but before we could move, the figure raised one of its long arms and released something into the air, a cloud of spores that shimmered faintly in the dim light. "Don't breathe," I shouted as I pulled my jacket over my mouth and nose. James did the same, but it was too late for him. He stumbled forward and fell to his knees, coughing violently as he inhaled some of the spores. "James!" I cried out as I knelt beside him. His eyes were wide with fear as he clutched at his throat. "It's inside me," he gasped. I didn't understand what he meant until I saw his skin start to change, small patches of bark-like texture forming on his hands and arms where the spores had settled. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring our fear. I scrambled backward with James in tow, desperate to get away from whatever this thing was. But every time we moved farther from the circle, vines and roots seemed to grow faster around us, blocking our path and pulling us back toward the clearing. It wasn't just hunting us, it was controlling everything around us. I grabbed James's arm and forced him to stand despite his weakened state. "We're not staying here," I said firmly. But deep down, I wasn't sure if we'd make it out alive. I don't think I've ever felt fear like I did in that moment. The forest wasn't just a place anymore. It was alive, and it wanted us gone. Or worse, it wanted us to stay forever. James was struggling to stand, his breathing shallow and his face pale. The patches of bark-like texture on his skin were spreading, crawling up his arms like something alive. I could see the panic in his eyes as he looked at me, silently begging me to fix this, to save him. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced as I tried to think of anything that could stop this thing, this ancient consciousness that seemed to control the forest itself. And then I remembered the copper sulfate in my pack, the chemical I used to treat fungal infections on plants. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. "James," I said urgently, grabbing his shoulders, "listen to me. We need to get back to the ranger station. There's more copper sulfate there, enough to disrupt whatever this thing is." He nodded weakly, but I could tell he didn't believe we'd make it. Neither did I. The figure stepped closer again, its hollow face tilting as if it were studying us. The amber sap that flowed through its veins dripped onto the ground, and wherever it landed, new mushrooms began to grow instantly. I pulled James forward, forcing him to move, even though every step seemed harder than the last. The vines and roots around us grew faster now, twisting and curling like they were alive, trying to trap us. The whispers grew louder in my ears, repeating my name over and over again in that eerie voice made of wind and hollow branches. "Marlene. Marlene." I wanted to scream, but I couldn't waste the energy. Every ounce of strength had to go toward getting us out of there. James stumbled again, falling hard onto the ground. "I can't," he gasped. "I can't keep going." "You have to," I said firmly, pulling him up again even though my own legs felt like they might give out at any moment. But then he stopped moving altogether and looked at me with a strange calmness in his eyes. "I'm not going to make it," he said quietly. "Don't say that," I snapped, refusing to accept what he was telling me. He shook his head slowly and held up his arm so I could see how far the bark-like texture had spread, up past his elbows now and creeping toward his chest. "I'm already part of it," he said softly. "You need to go." "No," I said firmly, shaking my head as tears blurred my vision. "I'm not leaving you." "You don't have a choice," he said with a weak smile. "It wants me now." Before I could argue further, James turned back toward the mushroom circle and began walking toward it on his own. "James!" I shouted, running after him, but vines shot up from the ground between us, blocking my path and pulling him closer to the circle. He turned back one last time and gave me a look that broke my heart, a look of acceptance mixed with determination. "Go," he said simply. "Stop it before it spreads." And then he stepped into the circle. I watched helplessly as the figure reached out toward him, its long arms wrapping around him like roots claiming their place in the soil. His body stiffened as the bark-like texture consumed him completely until he was no longer James, but something else entirely. A tree-like sentinel stood where he had been moments ago, its branches twisting upward toward the sky as if reaching for something beyond this world. I felt a wave of anger and grief crash over me as I turned away from the circle and ran faster than I ever thought possible, toward the ranger station. The whispers followed me all the way there, growing louder with every step until they were deafening in my ears. Marlene. Marlene. When I finally reached the station, I grabbed every container of copper sulfate I could find and rushed back into the forest despite my exhaustion and fear. The mushroom circle was still there when I returned, but so was James's transformed body standing guard over it like a sentinel. I couldn't look at him, not directly, because if I did, I knew I wouldn't have the strength to do what needed to be done. I opened one of the containers and poured the copper sulfate onto the ground. Around the circle, the reaction was immediate. The mushrooms began to shrivel and blacken as if they were burning from within. The figure screamed, or at least that's what it sounded like, as its form began to dissolve into ash carried away by the wind. But as the fungal network died off, something hit me. A psychic backlash so strong that it knocked me off my feet and left me blind for what felt like hours. When my vision finally returned, the forest was quiet again. Too quiet. And James was gone. The forest was still. The only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze, but even that felt hollow, like the forest was holding its breath. I sat on the damp ground, my hands trembling as I stared at the spot where James had been. He was gone. The mushroom circle was blackened and lifeless now, the copper sulfate having done its job. The strange figure, whatever it had been, was gone too, reduced to nothing but ash scattered across the mossy floor. But James wasn't coming back. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaky beneath me. My head still throbbed from whatever psychic blow I'd taken when I destroyed the fungal network, and my vision was blurry around the edges. I wiped at my eyes, hoping it would clear, but it didn't. I stumbled back toward the ranger station, each step heavier than the last. The forest felt quieter now, too quiet, but I could still feel it watching me. Not in the same way as before, but something lingered, just out of reach. When I finally reached the station, I collapsed onto the wooden steps and let out a shaky breath. My body ached, my mind was spinning, and all I could think about was James's face as he told me to go, his calm acceptance of what was happening to him. I stayed there for hours, staring out at the trees and trying to make sense of what had happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't explain it, not with science or logic or anything else that had guided me my whole life. The next day, I went back to the cathedral with a team of rangers to investigate. The mushroom circle was gone, completely erased as if it had never been there in the first place. The trees looked normal again, their bark smooth and unmarked by amber sap, but something had changed in me. As we walked through the forest, I began noticing things I hadn't before. The way the trees seemed to hum faintly when I touched them, the way their branches swayed slightly even without wind. It was like I could feel them now, sense their presence in a way that wasn't entirely natural. And then there were the whispers. They were faint now, barely audible over the sounds of the forest, but they were still there. Soft murmurs that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, not about James or the entity or what I'd done to stop it. Who would believe me? Even if they did, what good would it do? But as the weeks went by, I started noticing something else, something that made my stomach twist with dread. New mushroom circles were appearing throughout the park. They were smaller than the one we'd found in the cathedral, but they were growing fast, and they weren't random. From above, they formed a pattern, a spiral stretching across miles of forest land. I knew then that it wasn't over, that whatever ancient force we'd encountered wasn't gone. It was just waiting, spreading, quietly beneath our feet like roots digging deeper into the earth. And now it knows my name. My name is Raymond Blackfeather. I'm a senior wildlife biologist and park ranger here at Yellowstone National Park. I've spent most of my life in these woods, watching over the land, the animals, and the strange beauty that only a place like this can offer. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened in the autumn of 1987. It started just before the first big snowfall, late in the season. The air was colder than usual, biting at my skin even through my thick jacket. The grasses in the valley had turned brown, but the aspen trees still clung to their bright yellow leaves like they were trying to hold on to summer. It felt like the world was caught between seasons, not quite ready to move forward. The sun was low on the horizon, hanging there for what felt like hours, casting long shadows over everything. The geothermal features, the bubbling mud pots and hissing steam vents were louder than usual, almost as if they were alive and restless. Even the geysers seemed to erupt more frequently, their boiling water shooting into the air with a force that made my chest tighten. I was deep in the backcountry, far from where tourists usually go. It's quiet out there this time of year. No cars, no chatter, just me and nature. But something was off. The animals knew it before I did. I first noticed it with the elk. They were moving in huge numbers, more than I'd ever seen before, all heading in the same direction, away from the valley. Bison followed them, their heavy hooves thundering against the ground. Even predators like wolves and bears seemed to be part of this strange migration. It didn't make sense. Predators don't follow prey like that unless something bigger is, driving them away. The frost patterns on the ground caught my eye next. They weren't random like they usually are. They looked deliberate, almost intelligent, forming shapes that melted and reappeared as if they were alive. I tried to shake it off as a trick of the light, or my tired mind playing games with me after long hours out here alone. Then came the snow, a strange kind of snow that fell only within a perfect 5-mile circle around me. It wasn't falling anywhere else in the park, just here. I checked my radio to call it in, but all I got was static. That wasn't unusual near geothermal areas. Magnetic interference often messed with signals out here. But still, it felt wrong. The unease grew when I stumbled upon something near one of the hot springs, a cluster of prehistoric insects perfectly preserved in ice that had started melting from the heat of the spring. They looked ancient, like something out of a museum exhibit, but they were intact. Too intact. It was as if they'd been frozen yesterday instead of thousands or millions of years ago. I bent down to get a closer look when I felt it. The ground beneath me shifted ever so slightly, like something massive was moving deep below the surface. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my training told me to stay and investigate. That's when I saw them. The tracks. They weren't animal tracks or anything I'd ever seen before in my years as a ranger. 3-toed footprints with an odd weight distribution pressed into the soft earth near another hot spring. They started at the edge of the spring and led away into the woods, but there were no tracks leading to it. The sun finally dipped below. The horizon and darkness began to settle over Yellowstone. The distant howls of wolves echoed through the trees, but even those seemed off somehow, like they were warning me about something I couldn't see yet. I stood there for a long moment, staring at those tracks and feeling a cold knot form in my stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. Something wasn't right here. My name is Raymond Blackfeather. I've been working in Yellowstone for over 20 years, and I've seen just about everything this park has to offer. Storms that can knock down trees like matchsticks, animals fighting for survival, even tourists doing things so dumb you'd think they were trying to get themselves killed. But this was different. I'm from the Crow tribe, born and raised not far from here. My people have always had a deep connection to the land. We respect it, listen to it, and know when something's wrong. My grandfather used to tell me stories about Yellowstone, stories about spirits that lived beneath the ground, sleeping for centuries until something woke them up. As a kid, I thought they were just tales meant to scare me into behaving. But now I wasn't so sure. I'm 45 years old, and life hasn't exactly been kind lately. 3 years ago, I lost my wife, Sarah. She was a scientist, too, a geologist who loved this park as much as I did. She got sick with a rare neurological disease that no one could explain. It started with small things, forgetting words, losing her balance, but it got worse fast. By the end, she couldn't even recognize me. After she passed, I found her field journal tucked away in her desk. The last few entries didn't make any sense. She wrote about hearing strange sounds coming from below the ground and feeling like something was coming up. At the time, I thought it was just her illness talking. But now, standing there in the snow with those strange tracks in front of me, I couldn't help but think about her words. I carry that journal with me everywhere I go. It's worn and faded now, but it's all I have left of her. Sometimes when things get quiet out here, I'll open it up and read her notes, hoping to find some kind of answer. Or maybe just a little comfort. That night, I wasn't alone in the backcountry. Adam Kendrick was with me, a seasonal ranger, who'd only been working here for a few months. He was younger than me by almost 10 years and came from a big city where he'd been a cop. He never talked much about why he left that life, but I could see it in his eyes. Something had broken him, and he'd come out here looking for peace. Adam was good at his job, but inexperienced when it came to the wilderness. He relied on me to guide him through the rough terrain and teach him how to read the land. He didn't have my knowledge of animal behavior or my ability to sense when weather was about to turn bad, but he had heart, and sometimes that's enough. That night, as we sat by the fire trying to warm up after hours of hiking through the snow-covered woods, Adam broke the silence. "You ever seen anything like this before?" he asked, staring into the flames. "No," I said simply. He looked at me like he wanted more of an answer. But what could I say? That everything about this felt wrong? That my gut was screaming at me to pack up and leave? No. He needed calm. Right now, not panic. Probably just some weird geothermal activity, I added after a moment. This place is full of surprises. Adam nodded slowly but didn't look convinced. Those tracks we found, what do you think made them? I shook my head. I don't know. And that was the truth. I didn't know. But deep down, something told me we weren't dealing with any animal or natural phenomenon. The fire crackled softly between us as we sat in silence again. The sounds of the park at night surrounded us. The distant howl of wolves, the bubbling of nearby hot springs, and something else. Something faint but steady, like a heartbeat. "Do you hear that?" Adam asked suddenly. I nodded. Yeah, it was coming from one of the thermal vents nearby. A low, thumping sound that seemed to grow louder when we got closer earlier in the day. At first, I thought it might be some kind of pressure buildup underground, a natural occurrence in a place like this, but now it felt like something more. The wind picked up suddenly, sending a chill through my jacket and making the trees around us creak and groan. The fire flickered wildly for a moment before settling down again. "We should get some rest," I said finally. "Long hike tomorrow." Adam didn't argue. He wrapped himself in his sleeping bag and lay down near the fire while I stayed awake a little longer, staring into the darkness beyond our camp. Something was out there. I could feel it. The next morning, the world felt heavy. That's the only way I can describe it. The air was still, almost too still, and the sky was a dull gray that made it hard to tell if it was morning or evening. Even the animals were quiet. No birds, no rustling in the bushes, nothing. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. Adam and I packed up camp and started hiking toward the thermal basin where we'd found those strange tracks the day before. I wanted to take another look, maybe figure out what we were dealing with. Adam didn't say much as we walked, but I could tell he was uneasy. So was I. We reached the basin by mid-morning. The ground here was warm underfoot, even with snow covering. Most of it. Steam rose from the hot springs, twisting and curling in the cold air like ghostly fingers. The smell of sulfur was stronger than usual, burning my nose and throat. I pulled out my GPS device to map the area. It's something I always do when I'm out here, just to keep track of changes in the landscape. But when I looked at the screen, my stomach dropped. "Something wrong?" Adam asked, noticing my expression. I held up the GPS so he could see for himself. "The thermal features, they've moved." "What do you mean, moved?" he asked, frowning. I pointed to the screen. "These hot springs and vents, they've shifted positions by almost 9 inches since last year." Adam stared at me like I was speaking another language. "Is that even possible?" "No," I said quietly. "Not like this. Geothermal. Activity can cause small changes over time, but this was too precise, too uniform. Every feature had moved in exactly the same direction by exactly the same amount. It didn't make sense. As we stood there trying to process what we were seeing, a strange vibration ran through the ground beneath our feet. Not strong enough to knock us off balance, but enough to make my teeth buzz. It wasn't an earthquake. I've felt plenty of those before. This was different, like a deep hum coming from somewhere far below us. Adam looked at me nervously. "What is that?" "I don't know," I admitted. We decided to keep moving, following the tracks we'd found earlier. They led us deeper into the basin, where the snow seemed untouched except for those strange three-toed footprints. The farther we went, the more unsettling things became. At one point, we came across a small hot spring that seemed normal at first glance, clear water bubbling gently in a shallow pool. But as we got closer, I noticed something odd. The water wasn't just bubbling, it was moving upward, defying gravity for brief moments before settling back down again. "Did you see that?" Adam whispered. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I knelt down near the edge of the spring and dipped a test strip into the water to check for contamination. Maybe some kind of chemical imbalance could explain what we were seeing. But when I pulled out the strip and checked it against my chart, nothing. The water was clean. I scooped up a small sample in a vial and gave it a sniff out of habit. That's when I noticed it. A faint metallic taste in the air that made my tongue tingle and my stomach churn. "Let's keep moving," I said quickly, standing up and brushing snow off my knees. As we continued deeper into the basin, things only got stranger. We found more tracks, some leading away from hot springs like before, others circling back on themselves in patterns that didn't make any sense. At one point, we came across a patch of ground where every blade of grass had been burned to ash, in a perfect circle about 10 feet wide. "What could have done this?" Adam asked, his voice shaky. "I don't know," I said again, the same answer I kept giving him because it was all I had. By early afternoon, our equipment started acting up. My GPS stopped working entirely. Its screen went blank no matter how many times I reset it. Adam's flashlight flickered and died even though he'd just replaced the batteries that morning. Only our analog gear, compasses and maps, still worked. But even those gave readings that didn't make sense. Then we heard it. a sound coming from one of the larger vents nearby. At first, it sounded like steam escaping under pressure, a common noise in this area, but as we got closer, it changed. It wasn't random anymore. It had rhythm, like a heartbeat. Adam froze beside me. "Raymond, what is that?" I didn't answer because I didn't know how to explain what we were hearing, or why it seemed to grow louder as we approached. And then there were the ravens, dozens of them perched in perfect circles around several hot springs nearby. They weren't cawing or flapping their wings, they just sat there silently, watching us with unblinking eyes. It felt like they were waiting for something. Or someone. I tried to focus on what little evidence we had. The tracks, the strange water behavior, the vibrations, but none of it added up to anything logical or natural. That's when Adam pointed toward one of the smaller pools ahead of us and whispered two words that sent chills down my spine. "It's breathing." I followed his gaze and saw what he meant. The surface of the water rising and falling slowly, like lungs expanding and contracting. For a long moment, neither of us moved or spoke. The only sound was that steady, heartbeat-like thumping coming from deep within the earth. Something was alive down there, and it wasn't human. We stood there, frozen, staring at the small pool of water that seemed to be breathing. The surface rose and fell in slow, steady movements, like it was alive. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the weight of the silence around us. Even the wind had stopped. Adam whispered, "Raymond, what is this?" I didn't answer. What could I say? That I had no idea what we were looking at? That every instinct in my body was telling me to turn around and run? But I couldn't. Something about this thing held me there, like it was daring me to come closer. The ground beneath us trembled again, just slightly, but enough to remind us that we were standing on unstable land. Yellowstone's geothermal features are unpredictable at the best of times, but this wasn't normal. None of this was normal. Then it happened. The water in the pool rippled violently and a shape began to rise out of it. At first, it looked like steam, a thick, translucent form that shimmered in the cold air. But as it grew taller, I realized it wasn't steam at all. It was flesh, or something like flesh. It was translucent, almost jelly-like, with veins, of glowing light running through it like molten lava trapped under a thin shell. Adam stumbled back, nearly falling over his own feet. "What the hell is that?" he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. I didn't answer because I couldn't take my eyes off it. The thing kept rising until it stood at least 10 feet tall, its form shifting and pulsing as if it couldn't decide what shape to take. It had no face, no eyes, just a mass of translucent tissue that seemed to ripple with every movement we made. Then came the sound, a low, guttural noise that vibrated through the air and into my bones. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, like something ancient and powerful was trying to communicate with us in a language we couldn't understand. Adam reached for his gun, a standard-issue sidearm we carried for emergencies. But before he could draw it, the thing moved. It didn't walk or crawl, it just shifted, like liquid flowing across the ground toward us. "Stay back," Adam shouted, pulling his gun and firing 3 quick shots into the mass. The bullets hit their mark, or at least they should have, but instead of stopping the thing, they were absorbed into its body without leaving so much as a mark. The glowing veins inside it pulsed brighter for a moment before returning to their steady rhythm. "Raymond!" Adam yelled, panic in his voice as he backed away from the creature. "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. Not then. But I knew one. Thing for sure. This wasn't something we could fight with weapons or force. This was something older than us. Something that didn't belong in our world but had somehow found its way here. The creature stopped moving for a moment and seemed to study us, or maybe mimic us. Its form shifted again, growing arms and legs that looked almost human but not quite right. The proportions were off, too long and too thin to be real. Then came the sound again, a deep rumble that made my ears ring and my vision blur for a moment, and then I heard my wife's voice. Raymond. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. Sarah's voice calling out to me from somewhere deep within the creature's mass. My chest tightened as I stared at it, unable to move or look away. Raymond. Her voice called again. Louder this time. I knew it wasn't her. I knew that. But hearing her voice after all these years broke something inside me. For a split second, I wanted to believe she was there, that somehow she'd been trapped in this thing and needed me to save. Her. Don't listen to it, Adam shouted, snapping me out of my trance. He grabbed my arm and pulled me back just as the creature lunged forward with surprising speed for something so massive. The ground beneath us cracked from the force of its movement, sending chunks of earth flying into the air. We ran, both of us sprinting as fast as we could through the snow-covered basin while the creature followed close behind. It didn't make any noise as it moved except for that low hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It didn't chase us directly either. It disappeared into one of the larger thermal vents only to reappear moments later from another vent ahead of us, cutting off our path. It's using the geothermal network. I shouted over my shoulder as we skidded to a stop. What does that mean? Adam yelled back. It means we're not safe anywhere near these hot springs, I said. The creature emerged again from another vent nearby, its form shifting once more, this time taking on shapes that resembled animals. An elk's antlers here, a wolf's snout there, all blending together into one grotesque mass. It let out another rumble, this one louder than before, and suddenly steam vents all around. Us erupted with scalding heat and pressure. We barely managed to dodge them as we scrambled for higher ground. By now, my mind was racing, not just with fear, but with questions. What was this thing? Why was it here? And, most importantly, how could we stop it? As we reached a ridge overlooking the basin below us, I turned back for one last look at the creature before it disappeared into another vent. This wasn't just some random anomaly or freak occurrence. This was deliberate. Something had woken up beneath Yellowstone, and whatever it wasn't going back to sleep anytime soon. We didn't stop running until we were far from the basin, the creature's strange hum fading behind us. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were about to give out, but I kept going. Adam was right behind me, his face pale and his breathing ragged. We found shelter in a rocky outcrop high above the valley where the snow was deeper and the air colder. For a moment, it felt safe, like we'd finally put some distance between us and whatever that thing was. But I knew better. It's not going to stop, I said, leaning against the rock to catch my breath. Adam looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. What do you mean? It's gone. I shook my head. No, it's not gone. It's just waiting. He didn't argue, but I could see the panic in his eyes. He was trying to hold it together, but this wasn't something you could prepare for. Not with training or experience or anything else. This was something ancient, something beyond human. Understanding. As we sat there in the cold, I remembered my grandfather's stories, the ones about the sleeper, a being that lived beneath the earth and woke up during times of great upheaval. He said it wasn't evil, but it wasn't good either. It was just hungry. It fed on life, absorbing everything it touched until there was nothing left. I never believed those stories before. But now I wasn't so sure. Adam broke the silence after a while. Raymond, what do we do? I didn't answer right away because I didn't know. How do you fight something that can't be hurt? Something that moves through the earth like water and uses the land itself as a weapon? Then it hit me. The cold. The creature relied on heat to survive. That much was clear from how it moved through the geothermal vents and avoided areas where the snow was thickest. If we could lure it to higher ground, somewhere colder, It might weaken enough for us to stop it. "There's a plateau near the North Ridge," I said finally. "It's high enough that the temperature drops below freezing even during the day." Adam frowned. "And what? We just hope it freezes to death?" "It's our best shot," I said firmly. He didn't look convinced, but he nodded anyway. "How do we get it up there?" I hesitated for a moment before answering. "We bait it." Adam stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "Bait it? With what?" "With us," I said quietly. He didn't argue this time. He just nodded again and started checking his gear. His hands were shaking as he loaded fresh batteries into his flashlight, even though we both knew it wouldn't work near the creature. "Let's go," he said finally. We made our way toward the North Ridge as quickly as we could, sticking to areas where the snow was deepest and avoiding any signs of geothermal activity. The climb was brutal, steep and slippery, but we pushed through, knowing that every second counted. By the time we reached the plateau, the sky had darkened, and the wind had picked up, carrying icy flakes that stung our faces. The temperature had dropped sharply, and my joints ached from the cold, a familiar pain that told me a storm was coming. "This is it," I said as we reached the center of the plateau. Adam looked around nervously. "What now?" "Now we wait," I said. We didn't have to wait long. The ground trembled beneath us again, stronger this time, and cracks began to form in the ice-covered rock around us. Steam vents erupted in quick bursts as if announcing its arrival. And then it came. The creature emerged from a fissure near the edge of the plateau, its translucent form glowing faintly in the dim light. It was smaller now, less massive than before, but still terrifying in its fluid movements and unnatural shape. Adam raised his gun instinctively but didn't fire this time. He knew it wouldn't make a difference. The creature moved toward us slowly, almost cautiously, as if testing its limits in this colder environment. Its glowing veins pulsed erratically now, struggling against the freezing air. "It's working," I whispered, but then Adam stumbled. His foot slipped on an icy patch and he fell hard onto his side. Before I could help him up, the creature lunged forward with surprising speed, its mass shifting and stretching toward him like liquid fire. "Adam!" I shouted. He turned to look at me, his face pale but calm, a calm that sent chills down my spine because I knew what it meant. "I'll distract it," he said quietly, pulling himself to his feet despite his injuries. "No," I shouted again, stepping toward him, but he shook his head firmly. "It's connected to me now." Somehow, I didn't understand what he meant until I saw his arm. The skin where he'd been burned earlier by one of those thermal eruptions had changed somehow, blending with something unnatural from the spring water. "I can feel it," he continued, softly. "It knows me." Before I could stop him, Adam turned and ran toward the edge of the plateau, shouting and waving his arms to draw the creature's attention away from me. "Come on," he yelled at it. "You want me? Come get me." The creature followed him without hesitation, its form shifting faster now as if sensing its prey's desperation. And then the blizzard hit. The wind howled around us like a living thing, carrying snow and ice that cut through everything in its path, including the creature. Its translucent flesh began to freeze almost instantly, cracking and splintering like glass under pressure. Adam reached the far edge of the plateau just as the creature lunged toward him one last time, but instead of absorbing him like before, its frozen mass shattered into countless pieces that scattered across the icy ground. I ran toward Adam as fast as I could through the blinding snowstorm, calling his name over and over again until I finally found him lying near one of those shattered fragments. He looked up at me weakly and smiled, a small smile that broke my heart because I knew what it meant. "It worked," he whispered before closing his eyes for good. I stayed there with him until morning when the storm finally passed and silence returned to Yellowstone once more. But even then, even with the creature destroyed, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not really. The storm had passed, but the world didn't feel the same. The air was still, heavy with a kind of silence that made my ears ring. I sat, there on the plateau, staring at the shattered pieces of the creature scattered across the icy ground. They looked like shards of glass glittering in the early morning light. Adam was gone. I stayed by his side until the snow stopped falling, keeping him company even though I knew he couldn't hear me anymore. He'd saved me, saved all of us. But at a cost I could never repay. I felt numb as I made my way back down to the valley, each step heavier than the last. The snow crunched under my boots, and the cold bit at my face, but I barely noticed. My mind was racing with questions. Questions I knew I'd never get answers to. What was that thing? Where did it come from, and why now? Back at the ranger station, I tried to report what had happened, but my radio was still dead. Just static no matter how many times I adjusted the frequency. Even the landline wasn't working. The storm must have knocked out power to the area. Wrote everything down in my logbook instead. Every detail I could remember about the creature, the tracks, and Adam's sacrifice. It felt pointless, like throwing words into a void, but it was all I could do to make sense of what had happened. Later that day, as I sat by the fire trying to warm up and clear my head, I opened Sarah's journal, the one she'd left behind, before she died. Her final entries were even stranger now that I read them again. She'd written about hearing sounds coming from deep within the earth, low vibrations that felt more than heard, and seeing patterns in the frost that seemed deliberate. She described feeling like something ancient was waking up beneath Yellowstone, something tied to the land itself. Her last entry stopped me cold. Whatever it is, it's waiting for something. A change in the earth, maybe. A shift. It's been here longer than us. Longer than anything we know. I closed the journal and stared into the fire for a long time. It wasn't just her illness talking. She'd known something was wrong long before anyone else did. And now it felt like she'd been right all along. Over the next few days, things started returning to normal, or at least as normal as they could be after what had happened. The snow melted in most areas, and animals began moving back into the valley like nothing had happened. But every time I passed by one of those thermal vents or hot springs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, watching, waiting. I went back to the plateau once more before leaving Yellowstone for good. The shards of the creature were gone, melted away by the sun or carried off by the wind. But I found something else. Tiny fragments of ice near one of the cracks in the ground where it had emerged. They weren't ordinary ice. They shimmered, faintly in a way that reminded me of its translucent flesh. I didn't touch them. I couldn't bring myself to. But as I stood there staring at them, I felt a deep chill run through me that had nothing to do with the weather. It wasn't over. Not. Really, the land would heal. It always does. But whatever woke up beneath Yellowstone wasn't gone. It was just sleeping again, waiting for its next chance. As I left Yellowstone for what would be my last time as a ranger, I couldn't shake one final thought. The Earth is old, older than we can imagine, and there are things buried deep within it that we're not meant to understand. But sometimes they wake up anyway. My name is Dr. Catherine Norwood, but everyone calls me Kate. I'm a forest ecologist, and I've spent most of my life studying trees, fungi, and the hidden world beneath our feet. Some people think it's boring, but to me, it's magic. How roots and fungi talk to each other. How forests are like giant living organisms. I've always believed there's a reason for everything in nature. At least, I used to. It was spring 1973 when it all began. I had just arrived at Olympic National Park in Washington State, a place so green and alive it felt like stepping into another world. The rainforest there is ancient, with trees so tall they seem to touch the sky and moss hanging from every branch like curtains. The ground is soft and spongy with ferns and mushrooms everywhere you look. It's beautiful, but also heavy, like the forest is watching you. The weather didn't help. It rained almost constantly, just a mist most of the time, but enough to keep everything wet. Even when the sun broke through for a moment, it only made the moss glow brighter, like it was alive. And the sounds: dripping water, birds calling in the distance, and sometimes this eerie silence that made you stop and listen harder. I was there to study mycelium networks, the underground fungal systems that connect trees and plants. My assistant, Victor Lamont, was with me, a young grad student who knew more about mushrooms than anyone I'd ever met. We were setting up a research transect in an old-growth section of the forest that had never been fully studied before. It was so remote we had to fly in by helicopter. Otherwise, it would have been a 3-day hike through unmarked trails. The first few days were uneventful, just cataloging plants and soil samples, but something about the forest felt off. It started small. Victor noticed banana slugs gathering in perfect circles on the forest floor, something neither of us had ever seen before. Then there was the fog. Not normal fog that rolls down from the mountains, but this strange mist that seemed to rise, up from the ground itself. It clung to everything and left a faint, sweet smell in the air. One evening, as we were walking back to camp, we found a massive nurse log, a fallen tree that other plants grow on. But this one was different. It was completely hollowed out inside, like something had eaten it from within, yet it still supported full-size trees growing on top of it. Victor joked that maybe termites had gone on a diet of steroids, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night at camp, I couldn't sleep. The forest felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of roots crawling up through the ground and wrapping around my legs like snakes. The next morning, we woke up to find our equipment covered in dew. Not unusual. But when I looked closer, I saw tiny white threads growing on some of it. Fungi, maybe. But they hadn't been there yesterday. Still, I told myself there had to be an explanation for everything we were seeing. After all, I was a scientist, and science always has answers. Or so I thought. I should probably tell you a little more about myself. Like I said, my name is Kate Norwood. I'm 39 years old, and I've spent most of my life in forests like this one. I guess you could say trees are my life. I study how they grow, how they communicate through their roots, and fungi, and how everything in a forest is connected. It's fascinating work, though not everyone agrees. A few months before this trip, I published a paper about how plants might talk to each other, sharing nutrients or even warning each other about danger. It wasn't exactly well received. Most of the scientific community thought I was crazy. Trees don't talk, they said. But I knew I was onto something. This trip was supposed to be my chance to prove it. Victor, my assistant, was fresh out of grad school and full of energy. He was 26, tall and lanky, with a mop of curly hair that never stayed under his hat. He was passionate about fungi. He could name hundreds of species just by looking at them, and he had this way of making everything sound exciting. "Kate," he'd say, "we're going to discover something no one's ever seen before." I liked his enthusiasm, even if it sometimes made me feel old. But there was another reason I threw myself into my work so completely: my personal life. Well, let's just say it wasn't great. My daughter, Emily, hadn't spoken to me in years. She blamed me for choosing my career over her when she was growing up, and maybe she was right. I thought about her a lot while we were out there in the forest. Sometimes I'd wonder if she'd ever forgive me, or if she even cared what happened to me anymore. There was one thing I always carried with me on these trips: an old brass microscope that had belonged to my grandfather. He was a botanist too, and he disappeared in this very forest back in 1931. No one ever found out what happened to him, just his field journal, which ended with some very strange notes about the trees moving at night. Growing up, I used to think it was just a story my family told to scare me. But now, Now, I wasn't so sure. Victor and I spent our days collecting samples and taking notes. The trees here were ancient, some over 800 years old, and their roots were tangled together like a giant web under the ground. But when we took core samples from the trees to study their growth rings, we found something that didn't make sense. All the rings were identical. Different trees, different species, but somehow they all showed the same pattern of growth over the same years. "That's impossible," Victor said when we first noticed it. "Must be some kind of anomaly," I replied, though even as I said it, I didn't believe it. That evening, as we sat by the campfire going over our notes, Victor asked me if I believed in ghosts. "Ghosts?" I laughed nervously. "No. Why?" He shrugged. "I don't know. This place just feels alive." "It is alive," I said quickly, trying to keep things grounded in science. "That's what forests are, living systems." But deep down, his words stuck with me. The next day brought more strange discoveries. We found patches of moss growing, in perfect geometric shapes, circles, triangles, like someone had arranged them on purpose. And then there were the animals, or rather, the lack of them. Normally, you'd see deer or squirrels or hear birds chirping everywhere in a forest, like this one. But here, nothing came near certain trees. It was like they were avoiding them on purpose. By the time we got back to camp that night, both of us were on edge but trying not to show it. "I'm sure there's an explanation for all of this," I told Victor as we sat by the fire again. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I hope so." But neither of us really believed that anymore. The next morning started like any other. The rain had slowed to a drizzle and the fog was thicker than usual, curling around the trees like smoke. Victor and I packed up our gear and headed out to check on the transect we'd set up, a line through the forest where we were studying soil samples, tree growth, and fungal activity. But as we walked deeper into the woods, things started to feel wrong. The first thing we noticed was the smell. It wasn't the usual earthy scent of the forest, but something sweet and sickly, like overripe fruit. It made my head feel fuzzy, and I realized I couldn't remember how long we'd been walking. Victor seemed dazed, too, his movements slower than usual. "Do you smell that?" I asked him. "Yeah," he said, rubbing his temples. "It's weird." We stopped to take a break, and that's when I saw it. A patch of moss growing in a perfect spiral on the forest floor. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but then I noticed another spiral nearby. And another. They were everywhere. Victor crouched down to examine one. "This doesn't happen naturally," he said. I didn't reply. My eyes were drawn to something else. A massive tree with a branch that had been cut cleanly at some point in its life. Red sap oozed from the wound like blood. I leaned closer, my curiosity getting the better of me, and scraped some of it onto a slide for my microscope. What I saw made my stomach drop. Under the lens, the sap wasn't just plant cells. It looked like human blood cells mixed with something else. Something alien. I didn't tell Victor what I'd seen. Not yet. I didn't want to scare him, or myself. As we continued our work, things got stranger. Our electronic equipment started acting up. Static on the radios, time-lapse cameras glitching, but when we opened them up to check for damage, we found tiny fungal threads growing inside the circuits. Somehow, they seemed to make everything work better than before. "This is crazy," Victor said as he inspected one of the cameras. "It's like the forest is fixing things." I tried to laugh it off. Maybe it's just nature helping us out. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. That night at camp was worse than any before it. As we sat by the fire going over our notes, we heard something. A faint humming sound coming from beneath us. It wasn't loud enough to be disturbing, but constant enough that we couldn't ignore it. Victor grabbed one of our ultrasonic recording devices and set it on the ground near our tent. When he played back the recording later, his face went pale. "It's rhythmic," he said quietly, "like vibrations traveling through the roots." I didn't know what to say. My mind kept going back to my grandfather's journal, the one where he'd written about trees moving at night. We decided to set up one of our time-lapse cameras facing a cluster of ancient trees near our camp. If they were moving, if anything was happening, we wanted proof. The next morning, when we checked the footage, my heart nearly stopped. The trees had shifted, just inches, but enough that their positions were clearly different from where they'd been before. And it wasn't just random movement, they seemed to be leaning toward our camp. Victor stared at the screen in silence for a long time before finally saying what we were both thinking. "They're alive." After seeing the footage of the trees moving, neither of us could pretend everything was normal anymore. Victor kept pacing around camp, running his hands through his hair. I tried to focus on my notes, but my hands were shaking too much to write. The forest felt different now. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my skin crawl. It was like the trees were watching us. "We need to go," Victor said suddenly, breaking the silence. "This isn't safe." I wanted to agree with him, but something held me back. I couldn't leave, not yet. There were too many unanswered questions. What was happening here? Why were the trees moving? And what did it all mean? "Just one more day," I said, though my voice didn't sound convincing even to me. "We'll pack up tomorrow." Victor didn't argue, but I could see the fear in his eyes. That afternoon, we decided to check out a grove of older trees about half a mile from camp. They were some of the largest and oldest in the forest, what scientists call mother trees. These trees are like the heart of the forest, connecting everything through their roots. As we approached the grove, that strange, sweet smell returned, stronger than before. My head felt light, and I had to steady myself against a tree to keep from falling over. Victor looked pale too, his breathing shallow. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded. There was a faint sound coming from somewhere ahead of us. A low hum, almost like chanting. It wasn't mechanical or animalistic. It sounded alive. We pushed forward, and that's when we saw it. At first, I thought it was a person standing between two massive trees, a forest ranger maybe, but as we got closer, I realized it wasn't human at all. The figure was tall, at least 7 feet, and its body was made entirely of roots and moss and fungi twisted together into something that resembled a person. Its arms were long and thin like branches, and its face was made of shelf. Fungi arranged in a way that looked almost human, but not quite. It didn't move at first. It just stood there, watching us. Or at least, I thought it was watching us. Its eyes were dark hollows in the fungus. Victor grabbed my arm. "Kate," he whispered urgently, "we need to go." But I couldn't move. I felt drawn to it. There was something about it, something ancient and powerful, that made me want to step closer. And then it moved. Its head tilted slightly to one side as if curious about us. Then its branch-like arms stretched out toward us, and I felt an overwhelming urge to stay where I was, to let it touch me. "Kate!" Victor shouted, snapping me out of whatever trance I was in. He pulled me back just as the figure took another step toward us. That's when we saw what it could do. The ground beneath our feet began to shift as roots erupted from the soil like snakes, twisting and curling around our legs. Victor pulled out his knife and started hacking at them while I stumbled backward trying to free myself. The figure raised one arm and a cloud of spores burst into the air around it. The sweet smell became overpowering, and my vision blurred as my head spun. "Run!" Victor shouted, shoving me away from the roots. I didn't need to be told twice. We ran as fast as we could back toward camp, tripping over roots and branches along the way. The humming sound grew louder behind us, but I didn't dare look back. When we finally reached camp, we collapsed by the fire pit, gasping for air. "What? What was that?" Victor panted. "I don't know. I said honestly. But it's not just trees moving anymore. That night, neither of us slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing in the grove, or worse, stepping closer, to our camp. By morning, we both knew what we had to do: leave. But as we started packing up our gear, we realized something terrifying. The forest wasn't going to let us go so easily. Victor and I worked as fast as we could to pack up camp. Every sound in the forest felt louder now: the creak of branches, the rustle of leaves, even the drip of water from the canopy. It was like the forest was alive, watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. "We just need to make it to the clearing," Victor said, his voice shaking. "The helicopter will be here tomorrow morning. We'll be safe once we're out of here." I nodded, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. The forest felt different now, hostile. It wasn't just a place anymore. It was something alive, something aware. As we started hiking toward the extraction point, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees felt taller, their branches reaching lower like they were trying to grab us. The ground was soft and uneven, and every step felt harder than the last. Then we saw them, the root patterns. At first, I thought it was just normal tree, roots crisscrossing the forest floor. But as we walked further, I realized they weren't random at all. The roots formed deliberate shapes, circles, spirals, like they were marking territory. And they were everywhere. "Kate," Victor said quietly, pointing ahead. I followed his gaze and froze. The root patterns didn't just stop. They formed a boundary around us, like a fence. It wasn't obvious at first, but when I looked closer, I saw how they curved inward, tightening around us with every step we took. "We're trapped," Victor whispered. "No," I said quickly, trying to keep calm. "We just need to keep moving." But as we pushed forward, the forest fought back. The ground erupted beneath Victor's feet as roots shot up like spears, wrapping around his legs and pulling him down. He screamed as he tried to cut them with his knife, but they were too strong. "Kate," he shouted, "help me." I grabbed a branch and started hacking at the roots with everything I had. They bled red sap, like the tree branch I'd seen earlier, and for a moment I thought we might get free. But then I saw it, the figure from the grove. It stepped out from behind a tree, its root-like limbs twisting and curling as it moved, toward us. Its face, if you could call it that, seemed to shift and change as it got closer, almost like it was mimicking human features. Victor stopped struggling and stared at it in horror. It's alive," he whispered. "Don't look at it," I shouted, pulling him away from the roots. The figure raised one arm and another cloud of spores burst into the air around it. This time, they didn't just make my head spin. They burned my lungs like fire. I coughed and stumbled backward as Victor dropped to his knees. "I can't breathe," he gasped. I grabbed him by the arm and dragged him away from the figure, as fast as I could. The roots seemed to retreat for a moment, giving us just enough space to run. But Victor wasn't running anymore. He stopped suddenly and turned to face me, his eyes wide with terror. "Kate, it's inside me." "What are you talking about?" I asked desperately. He pulled up his sleeve to show me his arm, and my stomach dropped. Tiny fungal threads were growing under his skin like veins, spreading up toward his shoulder. "Ye can feel it," he said quietly. "It's changing me." "No," I said firmly. "We're going to get out of here." Victor shook his head. "You have to leave me." "I'm not leaving you," I shouted. But he didn't move. He just stood there as the figure stepped closer again, its root-like arms reaching out toward him. "Go," Victor said softly. "I'll hold it off." Before I could stop him, he turned back toward the figure and raised his knife. The last thing I saw was him charging at it as roots erupted from the ground around him again. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the clearing where the helicopter was supposed to pick us up. My lungs burned from running, and maybe from the spores. but I didn't care anymore. All I wanted was to get out of that forest alive. As I collapsed onto the ground near the clearing's edge, I heard something behind me, a faint humming sound coming from beneath the soil. The forest wasn't done with me yet. I don't remember much about what happened after I reached the clearing. The helicopter arrived just before nightfall, its blades cutting through the mist like a lifeline. The pilot, a Vietnam veteran named Jack, took one look at me and knew something was wrong. "Where's your partner?" he asked as he helped me into the helicopter. I couldn't answer. My throat felt raw from the spores, and my mind was spinning with everything I'd seen. Victor was gone. The forest had taken him. As we lifted off, I looked down at the trees below. They seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, their tops swaying gently in the wind. But I knew better now. It wasn't just a forest. It was something alive, something ancient and aware, and it wasn't finished with me. When we landed back at the ranger station, I tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed me. They said Victor must have gotten lost or fallen into a ravine. They sent out search teams, but they didn't find anything, not even his knife. I wanted to tell them about the figure we'd seen, about the roots and the spores, but every time I tried, my voice caught in my throat. How could I explain something that sounded so impossible? Even I wasn't sure if I believed it anymore. Weeks passed, but the forest stayed with me. My lungs burned constantly, and no doctor could figure out why. They said it might be an infection or allergies, but I knew better. The spores were still inside me. At night, I started hearing things, faint humming sounds coming from beneath my apartment floorboards. My plants grew faster than they ever had before, their leaves twisting toward me like they were trying to reach out. One night, I woke up to find my ferns arranged in a perfect spiral on my kitchen table, the same pattern Victor and I had seen in the forest. My heart raced as I stared at them, but I couldn't bring myself to move them. It felt like they were watching me. The dreams were worse. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw roots crawling up through the ground, wrapping around my legs and pulling me down into the soil. Sometimes I dreamed of Victor standing in the grove again, his body covered in moss and fungi, his eyes hollow and dark. I don't go near forests anymore, not even parks or gardens. But it doesn't matter how far away I stay. The forest is still with me. Sometimes I wonder if it's trying to tell me something, if it wants me to come back. Other times, I think it's just waiting for me to stop fighting. Last night, when I woke up from another nightmare, I found a single root growing out of my bedroom wall. I think it's already here,